Do you believe it is possible to separate love and work? And how far would you go to maintain both? Harper Williams walked down the company's long glass corridor, Blake Innovations, where huge signs displayed the name of the organization that, for her, represented the biggest dream of her career. Since my first semester of college, I had admired the work of Alexander Blake, a technology prodigy whose vision had transformed the market, developing innovative systems and pioneering artificial intelligence. Everything she knew about programming and the world of technology had a direct or indirect origin in the lectures, books, and articles he wrote and published. Harper considered him not only a distant mentor, but a life inspiration. For years, she imagined the day she would have the chance to work alongside him. And after much preparation, the opportunity had finally arisen. When she learned that Blake Innovations was recruiting new programmers, she saw her chance coming, but she also had a harsh revelation. Alexander's company had no women in technical programming positions. The few female engineers were in administrative or marketing departments, a situation that many disguised as corporate policy, but which Harper knew was a kind of informal barrier for women. Determined, she spent nights reflecting on what to do. The idea he finally came up with seemed absurd, but it was also the only way he could try to make his dream come true. Harper decided to assume the identity of Harry Williams, a programmer with an impeccable track record and respected certifications. Thanks to his talent, he managed to get an interview, but he knew that the real ordeal was yet to come: the presentation and meeting with Alexander Blake. She looked at herself in the reception mirror before being called. Her short hair and loose clothes made her look neutral, nothing that indicated the slightest trace of femininity. He took a deep breath when the receptionist showed him the way to Alexander's room on the upper floor. His name appeared in silver letters on the door, surrounded by minimalist walls and cool lighting. Harper felt her heart beating with a mixture of nervousness and excitement as she touched the doorknob. Upon entering, she was greeted by Alexander's deep and controlled voice. He was standing, analyzing some documents, and only looked up when she approached. Harper felt a chill run down her spine. Alexander Blake, in person, was even more intimidating than in the interviews and lectures he attended. With impeccable posture and a look that seemed to see beyond the surface, he exuded an overwhelming energy, the kind of presence that silenced anyone who entered his room. "Harry Williams, right?" he asked with a firm tone of voice, examining the resume he had in his hands. Harper nodded, controlling every slightest movement and expression. First impressions were everything, and she knew that any mistake would be fatal. Alexander started with direct, technical questions that ranged from questions about algorithms, complex problem solving, and systems analysis. Harper was prepared. She answered each question accurately, demonstrating a level of knowledge that, for a recent graduate, was rare to find. Alexander raised an eyebrow, apparently surprised by the answers and quick reasoning, but he showed no sign of confidence. It was as if there was an insurmountable barrier in his expression. With each response from Harper, he intensified the questions, testing her in ways that bordered on the unbearable. He seemed intent on finding any flaw, any blind spot, anything that suggested that Harry wasn't the brilliant programmer he made himself out to be. Harper, even intimidated, maintained control. Each answer seemed to tap into an invisible line of confidence that would hopefully land her the job. After a series of questions, Alexander crossed his arms, analyzing Harper with a searching look, as if trying to decipher something that still eluded him. "Where did you get this knowledge from?" he asked, in a colder tone. "You know, I've interviewed a lot of young people who recently graduated, and most of the time, their knowledge isn't even close to yours. So tell me, where did you get this experience from?" Harper felt the air catch in her chest for a second. The question was simple but revealing. She knew that the answer she gave would need to be careful, without room for suspicion. "I've always been very self-taught," he replied, keeping his voice calm. "Since my first year of college, I dove headfirst into programming. I wanted to understand not only what was taught in classes, but also what was beyond the course content. I spent nights and weekends studying on my own, developing projects and participating in programming challenges." Alexander remained silent for a moment. His gaze remained fixed on Harper, as if he were analyzing every word. trying to catch any hint of hesitation or insecurity. After a long moment of tension, he looked away and picked up a contract. Harry Williams, I do not tolerate mistakes, and I do not accept mediocrity in my team. You passed the test, but understand, this is just the beginning. I demand perfection. He extended the contract, watching her closely. Harper, even trying to maintain her composure, couldn't help but smile. She had done it. The routine started intense. In the early days, Alexander remained distant, watching from afar as Harper interacted with the company's system. She had the freedom to make adjustments and implement ideas, but always under the watchful eye of her new boss. Although he maintained a professional demeanor, Harper could not avoid the small moments in which his admiration for him shined through. Whether in the way he dedicated himself to projects or in his tireless pursuit of innovation, he was an example of obstinacy and discipline, a reflection of what she wanted to be, and that motivated her even more. But this admiration soon turned into a dilemma. During a meeting to present a new project, while Harper was explaining her proposal, Alexander interrupted her several times, questioning every detail. She began to realize that, for him, there was no such thing as good enough. Every line of code needed to be justified, every technical decision vehemently defended. Despite being prepared to face the demands, Harper felt that there was something more in Alexander's looks and gestures, as if he was trying to measure how much pressure she could withstand. One afternoon, after a presentation she thought was impeccable, Alexander asked Harper to redo some of the work, claiming he wanted an even greater level of detail. The request took her by surprise. She was exhausted, as she had already spent days on the project, barely sleeping, and the amount of demands seemed endless. She wondered if he would act the same way with other employees, or if she was specifically the target of more rigorous evaluation. That thought tormented her for a while, but Harper decided she couldn't fail. As the weeks passed, she began to get used to Alexander's exhausting pace and criticism, using each piece of feedback as fuel to improve her work. But one question remained. How far would he go to test his endurance? Could this be an indication that he still didn't trust his potential? On one of the most exhausting days, while alone in the conference room, Harper found herself staring at her reflection in the huge windows. With the city lights in the background, his disguise seemed even more obvious. There she was, dressed as Harry, with a haircut she hated and baggy clothes that hid who she really was. The doubt was, would it be possible to sustain the charade long enough to earn Alexander's respect and the chance to work alongside him? That night, sitting in front of her computer screen, Harper decided to challenge herself even more. Instead of just getting through the day's tasks, he spent hours developing a solution that Alexander found impossible to implement in a timely manner. The intensity of his work was such that, when he realized it, it was already dawn. She had to rush to hide the dark circles under her eyes and put on a clean shirt before another day at the office. When Alexander arrived and saw the completed project, his look was one of pure surprise. He didn't hide his admiration, but the stiffness soon returned. "Very good, Harry. But let's see how things go in the next phase," he said, leaving no room for celebrations. As the days passed, the intensity of demands and competition only increased. The pressure was always there, but unexpectedly, it only made Harper more determined. Alexander, although cold, did not fail to recognize the talent he saw in Harry, a recognition that, for Harper, was the perfect fuel to continue. Although tiring, that routine strengthened her, but it also brought new dilemmas. Every time Alexander praised her, a mixture of happiness and fear invaded her. She was closer to her dream, but she knew that this proximity was sustained by a secret. At every moment, a new question arose. How long would she be able to sustain this lie? Alexander studied Harry Williams with intensity, as if her every answer was a clue to decipher what was really in front of him. There was something about Harry that didn't fit the typical profile of the candidates he interviewed. In addition to his impressive technical precision, there was a touch of humility unusual for someone so confident in his abilities. Alexander knew how the best programmers could be, often arrogant and ready to challenge any authority, but not Harry. Harper maintained a calm and precise posture, trying to say as little as necessary, as if each response was calibrated so as not to exceed an invisible limit. She felt the weight of that gaze on her, and the room seemed to shrink with each question, with each silent analysis. The conversation followed an almost aggressive line, with Alexander seeking to test Harper's logic and ability to improvise, advancing through different programming themes and exploring hypothetical cases. At one point, he talked about a failure his team had faced a few years ago, a small but devastating error that had delayed $1 million project. "How would you solve this?" he asked, his eyes fixed on her, as if trying to capture any sign of hesitation or doubt. Harper realized it was a trap. He expected her to hesitate, to give a vague or unconvincing answer, but her knowledge was solid, and she knew that for a problem like that, the solution lay in precision and safety. With an almost strategic calm, she described each step of the solution, focusing on early error detection and how she would design a monitoring strategy to avoid the problem. When she finished, she noticed a subtle change in Alexander's face. A restrained surprise quickly transformed into an expression of distrust and reserve. "Interesting," he said, leaning back in his chair calculatedly, arms crossed. "But you're still young. Knowledge isn't acquired just by studying. It needs real experience." His tone was almost provocative, as if he expected Harry to give up or be intimidated. Harper, however, has faced distrust before. Despite his age, he had spent years developing his own projects and absorbing as much as he could from the resources that the college offered. She knew how much she had fought to be there, and that was what gave her the strength to keep her head held high. "I understand your concern, Mr. Blake," she replied, keeping her tone firm and cordial. "But I believe that practical experience can be gained in many situations, not just in large companies. I participated in several team projects and was part of programming marathons that required quick and accurate decisions. This type of experience taught me that sometimes the simplest solution is the most efficient." She faced him directly as she said this, without hesitation, in an attempt to convey the confidence that, deep down, she was beginning to feel. Alexander was silent, his eyes firmly fixed on her, as if he were calculating an answer or trying to decipher something deeper. Harper felt cold sweat on his palms, and for a second, feared he was noticing something out of the ordinary. The silence dragged on almost torturously, and she realized he wanted to see how far she could stay calm. It was a test, and she couldn't fail. Then, he gave a slight smile. "Very well, Harry," he said suddenly, breaking the silence with a change of tone that almost disconcerted her. "But I still want to see what you can do under pressure. There's no room for error here, and no room for amateurs either. And I need you to know that nothing, absolutely nothing, will go unnoticed." Those words sounded like a warning, a reminder that, for Alexander, trust was something that was hard-earned. Harper maintained her poise, although her racing heart betrayed her apparent calm. She knew he had challenged her, that he expected her to be just another candidate who would be intimidated by the pressure, by the brutal pace of Blake Innovations. But Harper wasn't like that. If something moved her, it was precisely the desire to overcome that challenge, to prove that she was worthy of being there, even if to do so she needed to hide her true identity. At the end of the interview, Alexander dismissed Harper with a simple nod, without giving any indication of the final decision. "Harry, my assistant will be in touch," he said, looking back at the computer screen as if the interview no longer mattered. She formally thanked him and left the room, but as she closed the door, she felt a wave of relief mixed with intense euphoria. "I knew I had done well, but I was also aware that this was just the beginning." Over the next few days, Harper waited anxiously for a response, her thoughts torn between fear that her deception would be discovered and excitement at a possible opportunity. Then, one morning, she received a formal email from Blake Innovations, inviting her to an integration meeting. She had done it. The feeling of triumph was overwhelming, but it was soon accompanied by an underlying uneasiness. This disguise would not be easy to maintain, especially with Alexander Blake seeming so attentive to every detail. But this was what she wanted. It was the dream she had been chasing for years, and she was willing to face whatever was necessary. On the first day of work, Harper wore more formal clothes, with neutral tones and an almost impersonal appearance. She took care to keep her hair hidden under a discreet hat, avoiding any risk of anyone noticing something different. He entered the building with the confident posture of someone who dominated the environment. But inside, he felt completely vulnerable. As soon as she presented herself at reception, she was taken to a meeting room where the technical team was waiting for her. Harper tried to remain calm, but the sharp look from Alexander, who was already there, sent a shiver up her spine. He studied her for a moment, and the intensity of that gaze made Harper wonder if he somehow suspected something. "Welcome to the team, Harry," he said, tone neutral. "Here, we are all demanded to the maximum. I am strict, and I hope that the results of your work live up to our expectations." His voice was calm, but carried an implicit warning, almost as if he was saying he wouldn't accept anything less than perfection. Over the next few weeks, Alexander delegated complex tasks to Harper, each of which required an impressive level of knowledge and precision. She spent sleepless nights studying, reviewing every line of code, and trying to meet the extreme demands. The pressure was intense, but Harper felt like she was being shaped by the experience. Even though she was tired, the feeling of overcoming motivated her. Alexander remained strict, but began to treat her with some consideration. He seemed to recognize the effort and dedication she put into each task, although he always continued to evaluate her reactions. In some meetings, he asked seemingly simple questions, but which required a quick and intelligent response. Harper remained attentive, analyzing each word before responding, knowing that any mistake could lead to her losing the trust she had gained. Despite all his determination, Harper knew that the lie he maintained was a constant risk. Every time Alexander praised her work or gave her greater responsibility, she felt a mixture of pride and guilt, wondering how long she could maintain her disguise. On a particularly tense day, while reviewing a code analysis with Alexander, she noticed that he was looking at her with a different intensity, as if he was trying to see something beyond what was apparent. She looked away, but that moment remained in her mind, bringing with her the uncertainty that he might suspect something. This fear became even more real when Alexander called her for a private conversation, with no one else present. He led her to his office, where the atmosphere was even more oppressive and personal, with shelves of technology books and diplomas that he proudly displayed. Harper, uncomfortable, felt pressured by his proximity. "Harry," he began, voice low but serious, "I have been watching your work very closely." He paused, as if calculating his next words. "Your performance has been excellent, but I need to know that you are truly committed to the company and our standards." Harper nodded, hiding her nervousness behind a mask of confidence. "Yes, Mr. Blake, I am fully committed." Alexander looked at her for a long moment, his eyes taking in every detail of her expression. "I hope you are," he said finally, in a controlled tone. "Because for me, integrity and transparency are essential. I trust only those who are sincere in every aspect of their work." His words were direct, but the intensity of his gaze suggested he expected more than just an empty statement. She responded with a determination that left no doubt. "I can assure you that my loyalty and efforts are completely focused on the company, sir." The answer was accepted, and Alexander seemed pleased if reserved. But the exchange left Harper with an extra conscience. Maintaining a disguise was no longer just a professional issue. Every day, she felt a delicate bond forming between them, a connection made of respect, but which was already beginning to have tones of something more. With each look and each word exchanged, she realized that her feelings were mixing dangerously with the admiration she felt for him, leading her to question how far this could go. Alone, she reflected on everything that was at stake. "I knew that if he discovered the truth, there would be no going back. But at the same time, each achievement made her want to continue." The intense routine at Blake Innovations had become a kind of psychological battlefield for Harper. Ever since she started working alongside Alexander, she knew she couldn't allow the slightest mistake, neither in her performance as Harry, nor in carrying out each demanding task he gave her. It was clear that Alexander offered no favors or sympathy to anyone. Any sign of vulnerability was exploited. For him, respect was something to be earned through efficiency, not through affection or charisma. In recent days, Alexander had been intensifying the challenges. The level of demand increased with each project, and Harper felt him watching her more and more closely, with a veiled curiosity that left her tense. Whenever she shied away from physical contact or avoided looking directly at him for too long, Alexander seemed to notice. And although his reactions were discreet, Harper noticed the slight frown or the inquisitive glint in his eyes. I was beginning to suspect that Harry was hiding something. It was then that Alexander took the next step. That afternoon, as they reviewed a technical report in his conference room, he paused the conversation and observed Harry with an enigmatic expression. "I need a task completed perfectly and quickly," he said, handing him a file. Harper picked up the document, and with a quick read, her stomach dropped. It was an immense task, resolving complex code and correcting accumulated flaws from a project that had been suspended months before. The entire team had failed to perfect that system, and many didn't even believe it was possible to complete it within the given deadline. "I need this completed within a week," Alexander announced in a deadpan tone. "I know it's a complicated project, but I believe you have the necessary potential." The words were pronounced almost sharply, and Harper understood the hidden intention behind the phrase. It was a test. He wanted to see how far she would go before she weakened. Harper accepted the challenge, even though he knew the task was bordering on impossible. That same night, she stayed late in the conference room, alone, surrounded by stacks of reports, with the cold light of the monitors illuminating her tired face. The first step was to understand the chaotic code that others had abandoned. Every line seemed to be intertwined with errors and flaws in logic that left her exhausted before she even began to solve it. The next morning, when she met Alexander, she noticed the way he was watching her, as if trying to assess the effect of tiredness on her. "Good morning, Harry," he said, with a slight smile that seemed to challenge her. "How's the project going?" Harper responded with a firm stance, masking his physical exhaustion. "It's a considerable challenge, sir, but I'm making progress." Alexander studied her for a moment, not hiding the touch of admiration mixed with distrust. Harper knew he was analyzing his every move, looking for a trace of insecurity or anxiety that might explain his impression that something was out of place. Harper's routine became a daily battle against time and exhaustion. Evenings were consumed by the complex code that filled the screen, and mornings began with bitter coffee and a facade of self-confidence. The deeper she delved into the code, the more she felt like she was in a personal struggle. The project became a symbol of what she needed to achieve to prove her worth to Alexander. But as the hours turned to dawn and she dedicated herself to the maximum, she realized that her effort had a limit and that no matter how much she wanted, her body began to give in. One night, exhausted after hours of intense concentration, Harper ended up dozing off in the conference room, her fingers still resting on the keyboard. When he woke up to the faint sound of footsteps in the corridor, he realized with a start that it was Alexander who was approaching. She tried to hide her fright and tiredness, but her body betrayed her. When he got up, his legs felt weak and he almost staggered. Alexander sensed her moment of weakness and, in an almost automatic act, reached out his hand to support her. "Harry, are you okay?" he asked, his eyes expressing a concern she never imagined she would see in him. Harper instinctively backed away, unable to hide his discomfort at the physical contact. "I'm fine, sir," she replied, avoiding looking him in the eye. Alexander's expression changed. A gleam of suspicion passed through his eyes, as if that reaction had finally confirmed what he suspected. He moved closer, keeping his tone casual, but Harper knew he intended to probe her deeper. "You always avoid physical contact, do you understand?" said Alexander in an almost casual tone, but his voice was coated with a deeper intention. Harper felt her heart race and forced a smile. "Sorry, sir, it's just an old habit," he replied, hoping the justification would be enough. However, Alexander continued to analyze her, suspicion reflecting in his serious gaze. Over the next few days, he intensified the testing and gave her more detailed tasks, as if expecting Harper to make some revealing error. To him, every little detail seemed like a clue, and Harper was constantly on the edge, afraid that any slip-up could expose his true identity. Alexander watched her often, his gaze turning into something close to an enigma for her. He seemed to want to reveal her every moment, and that made her more and more nervous. Harper began to notice that, in addition to the complex tasks, Alexander asked questions that apparently had no direct relation to the work, as if trying to start an informal conversation to get to know her better. One afternoon, while she was working on the difficult project, he passed by the office and casually commented, "You know, Harry, my first impression of you was that you were hiding something." The phrase took her by surprise, but Harper hid her nervousness by focusing on the monitor, where the codes were flashing like a kind of safe haven. "Well, sir, maybe it's just an impression. I'm reserved, yes, but it's just a matter of personality." Alexander gave an enigmatic smile and seemed to accept the answer, but Harper knew he wasn't satisfied. Deep down, she feared that he was just waiting for the right moment to push her further, as if he were baiting her to catch her off guard. She felt increasingly insecure, as if she were in a minefield where any false step would reveal her secret. At the end of that exhausting week, Harper finally handed the project over to Alexander. As he began to examine the work, she found herself torn between anxiety and pride. He had worked tirelessly, doing his best to ensure there were no failures. However, when Alexander reviewed the code, the neutral and calculating expression on his face made it clear that he still had his doubts about her. "Your work is impeccable, Harry," he said bluntly, as if there was something more he wanted to add, but held back. "You managed to complete a task that most of the team considered impossible. However, I still feel like I don't know you completely. There is something about you, something that always seems hidden." His tone was incisive, almost as if he was giving you one last chance to confess what you were hiding. Harper held his breath, trying to keep his expression calm and respond without hesitation. "I'm a focused person, sir. Maybe that's why I seem reserved." The answer was brief, and Alexander studied her for a moment longer, his gaze fixed and attentive, before looking away and ending the conversation. He looked frustrated, as if he was close to discovering something, but the answer wasn't enough to satisfy his curiosity. However, despite his success, Harper felt Alexander's siege tightening every day. He began to include her in strategic meetings, placing her alongside other executives, as if promoting her to test her further or to see her interact in more pressure situations. These meetings were exhausting. In addition to tiredness, Harper knew that any strange behavior could arouse even more distrust. One night, when she was already exhausted, she was surprised by a message from Alexander, asking her to come to his office. On the way, he reflected on the reason for so many tests. I didn't know if he was really trying to understand if she was loyal, or if there was something more behind each of his actions. Upon entering the office, Alexander was sitting, his eyes fixed on the monitor, but he looked away at her with a serious expression. "Harry, sit down," he said, indicating the chair in front of his desk. Harper obeyed, feeling the weight of tension in the air. He watched her for a moment before continuing. "I need someone to trust with an important project, and I have to be sure that you are who you say you are. Trust is a matter of character and honesty." Harper swallowed hard, feeling that he seemed to be even closer to revealing his secret. Alexander continued, "I want you to tell me, honestly, why you joined Blake Innovations." Harper knew it was time to put all his determination into the answer. He took a deep breath, keeping his gaze steady, and responded, "Sir, my only goal has always been to grow as a programmer and learn from the best. That's why I dedicated myself so much and why I chose your company." Alexander watched her with an unreadable expression, but for the first time, he seemed to give in, even if only slightly. He nodded, showing that he would accept that answer for now. Harper spent her days at a grueling pace of work, immersed in the project that Alexander believed to be insurmountable, testing every limit of her patience and intelligence. She knew that, more than a technical task, this was a definitive test to measure her ability, persistence, and above all, her self-control in the face of relentless pressure. This project was becoming not just a professional challenge, but a game of psychological chess, in which Harper needed to balance his talent with the impeccable disguise he maintained day after day. Amid the almost absolute silence of the meeting room, Harper hunched over the keyboard, the hours stretching into the early hours, while the code flowed in his mind like a natural language. Each line of programming was a calculated response, a strategic step that brought her closer to completing the project that other programmers at Blake Innovations had abandoned. The system she worked on was intricate, and not just because of the volume of data. Previous developers had left trails of failed attempts and confusing code that made the analysis even more complex. That night, Harper felt close to a decisive breakthrough, as if he had finally understood the essence of the problem. With her eyes fixed on the screen, she meticulously corrected each fragment, refactoring lines and inserting code snippets. The cold office environment seemed to pulse with the sound of his fingers hitting the keyboard, until, after a sequence of clicks and final adjustments, the system gave a positive response. The data flowed perfectly, without glitches or error warnings, and the task considered impossible was finally completed. For a moment, she was silent, taking in the magnitude of what she had just accomplished. Harper knew that this achievement was not just another work assignment, but an affirmation of what he was capable of doing. The euphoria was quickly replaced by a wave of caution. She needed to communicate to Alexander that the project was complete, and she was aware that he would react with the same intensity he applied to each test he subjected her to. With a mixture of pride and anxiety, she headed to his office the next morning, her heart pounding as she imagined Alexander's reaction. As soon as Harper entered, Alexander was on the phone, apparently engaged in an important conversation. She remained standing, waiting in silence, while he ended the call with an almost impatient wave, saying goodbye and putting the phone aside. "Harry," he said, looking up with a mixture of surprise and expectation, "I figured you had something to tell me." Harper nodded and handed over the technical report that documented each step of the solution he had implemented. Alexander quickly flipped through the document, eyes scanning the lines of code until he stopped abruptly, his expression turning into something she hadn't expected, a mix of astonishment and fascination. He didn't say a word. He just stared at the pages in front of him, switching between the computer screen and the report, checking the data with an intensity that made it clear how impressed he was. After a long moment of silence, he sat back in his chair and looked at Harper, as if seeing her for the first time from a completely new perspective. "Did you actually complete the task?" he asked, his voice low but with a hint of disbelief. Harper confirmed with a firm nod, trying to remain calm in light of his reaction. Alexander continued to watch her, his gaze piercing through the professional facade Harper had so carefully constructed. There was something about that exchange of glances that made her uncomfortable, almost vulnerable, as if she were naked in front of his relentless intelligence. Alexander slowly stood up and began to walk around the room, his face still immersed in a mix of perplexity and analysis. "I confess that I didn't expect anyone to be able to solve this problem," he admitted, with a slight smile that seemed like a break in his usual rigidity. "There were others who tried before, and they all failed. I had already resigned myself to the idea that it would be impossible." Harper remained serious, but the satisfaction he felt was undeniable. "I believe the detailed code analysis and a new approach to the monitoring system helped," she replied, trying to keep her voice neutral. But Alexander continued to watch her with unusual interest, as if he wanted to decipher not only her words, but what was behind every gesture or expression. From that day on, Harper noticed that Alexander seemed attentive to her every movement, every reaction she showed, even if it was minimal. He watched her during meetings, noticed every hesitation, and paid attention to every detail of her body language. It was as if he was searching for something that intrigued him deeply, something he was trying to understand without openly admitting it. This new type of attention caused Harper to become increasingly cautious, to the point of avoiding eye contact with him on certain occasions. But no matter how much she tried to escape that incisive gaze, she couldn't ignore the effect it had on herself. Alexander seemed closer and closer, like a presence that affected her in a subtle but inescapable way. And Harper was beginning to realize how uncomfortable his proximity made her. She felt vulnerable and feared that at any moment he might break through the facade he had created with so much effort. On one of the following days, as they worked together on a data analysis, Harper could feel Alexander's gaze fixed on her. He had asked her to check a sequence of records in a complex system, and as she did so, she noticed that he was studying her with a silent intensity, as if trying to absorb every detail. When she realized she was being watched, her concentration wavered momentarily, and she almost made a mistake in her analysis. He took a deep breath, controlling his tension, and finished the work with precision. But the impact of that exchange of looks remained marked in his mind. When he said goodbye to Alexander at the end of that day, he felt the weight of accumulated fatigue and pressure that was beginning to become a burden. The nights of intense work, the high expectations, and the constant effort to hide her true identity were slowly consuming her. Alexander, in turn, seemed to be increasingly suspicious, as if he was determined to find out what she was hiding. During a company celebration event, Harper tried to remain discreet and avoid situations that could expose her further. However, Alexander always seemed close, watching her with an interest that transcended the professional. There was something in that look that made her uneasy, a kind of restrained fascination, as if he were drawn to something he couldn't yet understand. Harper tried to maintain the facade, but she felt increasingly insecure, as if she were about to be exposed at any moment. At a certain point in the night, Harper decided to go out for a breather, escaping the hustle and bustle and pressure of that environment. She walked to the company's outdoor area, where she could feel the fresh night air and, at least for a few minutes, relieve the tension that constantly haunted her. However, after a few moments, he heard footsteps behind him. When she turned around, she found Alexander, who was looking at her with an expression that was difficult to decipher, a mix of curiosity and something deeper. "I didn't expect to find you out here, Harry," he commented, with a light but still intense tone. Harper smiled briefly, trying to hide her nervousness. "I needed some time away from the crowd," he replied, in a controlled tone that barely disguised his uneasiness. Alexander moved a little closer, his eyes fixed on hers, as if searching for something beyond words. Harper felt his heart beat faster, aware that this was a critical moment. She was alone with him, outside the safe and controlled environment of the office. And somehow, she knew that Alexander didn't intend to let her escape without at least trying to understand what intrigued him so much. "Harry," he began, his voice low but with a tone of sincerity that Harper had rarely heard. "You're an excellent programmer, and your work speaks for itself. But still, I feel like there's something about you that I'm not understanding, something that you seem to be hiding." She tried to keep her expression neutral, seeking a quick response. But Alexander continued to look at her intensely, as if he was waiting for her to reveal something more. Harper took a deep breath and responded, trying to remain calm. "I'm a private person, sir. I've always been like that. Nothing more than that." Alexander sighed, still staring at her, but seemed reluctant to press her further. "Okay," he said finally, although his expression made it clear that the answer didn't satisfy him. "But know that here at Blake Innovations, we are a team, and trust is an important value to me." He paused, and Harper felt those words carry a weight that went beyond simple statement. After that meeting, Harper began to feel even more pressured, as if the simple act of remaining silent and hiding her true identity became an immense effort. Alexander continued to watch her with intensity, but now there was a touch of admiration in his eyes, something that made her question how far he would go to reveal what she was hiding. At times, Alexander seemed almost vulnerable next to her, as if he wanted to understand who Harry really was and what motivated him. Harper realized that, increasingly, he saw her not just as a subordinate or a new hire, but as someone who held an unexpected fascination. And no matter how much she tried to remain distant, she felt trapped in that web of looks and silences, fearing the moment when he would finally discover the truth. Harper knew she couldn't go on like this for long, and every interaction with Alexander made her question how far she would be willing to go to keep her secret. The meeting room clock read 11:45 p.m. when Harper was called by Alexander to an urgent meeting. The message appeared on your monitor suddenly, interrupting the concentration that, until then, was completely dedicated to a complex data optimization task. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders, accumulated over the last few weeks of intense work, but she knew she couldn't refuse. Working at Blake Innovations required that level of commitment, and Harper was willing to do whatever it took to maintain her position and, more importantly, Alexander's trust. When he arrived at the meeting room, he found Alexander and two of the high-ranking executives arguing in low, intense tones. Alexander's face was serious, the lines of expression more pronounced in the cold light, and his gaze, when meeting Harper, carried a mixture of urgency and expectations. He gave her a brief wave, indicating to sit down and wait. Harper sat silently, crossing her arms to hide the nervousness coursing through her body. "Harry, we have a critical problem with the data security system," Alexander began, with the incisive tone he used in important situations. "The security team has detected a flaw that could expose our customers' sensitive information, and we need a solution now." Harper nodded, trying to quickly absorb the situation. The complexity of Blake Innovations' security system was known to all programmers at the company. It was a protection network that involved multiple layers of encryption and constant monitoring. But it seemed that something had gone unnoticed. While Alexander continued explaining the technical details, Harper mentally prepared himself for another programming marathon, aware that his ability to improvise and agility would be put to the test that morning. The executives left the room shortly after, leaving Harper and Alexander alone. The silence that fell between them was almost palpable, filled with expectation, and for Harper, a slight tension that he couldn't ignore. She began reviewing the code immediately, going through the lines with precision, looking for the flaw that threatened the security of the system. Alexander, although silent, remained beside her, watching her every movement with a look of absolute concentration. From time to time, he approached, leaning in to analyze what Harper was typing, while the monitor cast a faint glow on his face. The weight of his presence was intense. Harper felt as if his attention was a constant check on his abilities, a silent pressure not to miss even for a second. Dawn advanced, and the first hours passed at a pace of tension and tireless work. Harper typed and typed, rearranging the code, analyzing the system for anomalous patterns. Amidst her fatigue, her body began to show signs of wear and tear, and the fatigue made her rub her eyes frequently in an attempt to stay alert. It was then that, in a moment of distraction, his disguise almost fell apart. As he adjusted the code, Harper's hair, tied up in a makeshift fashion to maintain the hairy appearance, slid out of the cap, revealing a strand of long brown locks. She didn't realize it right away, but as she glanced at the reflection on the screen, panic took over. Her hand shook slightly as she smoothed her hair to disguise it, but the movement was subtle enough for Alexander to notice. "Is everything okay, Harry?" he asked, his voice soft, but filled with an interest that went beyond simple curiosity. His gaze swept over Harper's face with renewed attention, and she knew he had noticed something. Harper forced a smile, trying to hide her nervousness as she carefully adjusted her hat. "Yes, sir. It was just a reflex. Tiredness, perhaps," he replied, hoping that his justification was convincing enough. However, Alexander continued to stare at her for a few more seconds, his expression slightly suspicious, as if he was trying to decipher what he had seen. She focused on the code again, trying to move away from that feeling of exposure, but she knew that moment hadn't gone unnoticed. For a long time, the silence remained as she typed, and Harper felt his gaze fixed on her, more intense than ever. Every moment, he had the feeling that the secret he had been keeping with so much effort was on the verge of being discovered. It was as if Alexander was searching for any clue that could confirm his suspicions. At a certain point in the morning, Harper found the source of the problem in the system, a structural flaw that compromised the integrity of the encryption. Feeling a mixture of elation and relief, she quickly began correcting the code, explaining the technical details to Alexander as she typed. The level of concentration and confidence Harper demonstrated was remarkable, and Alexander seemed impressed. He watched her every move, his eyes still filled with that silent distrust, but now with a touch of admiration that Harper could feel. "You have indeed found the fault, Harry," he said finally, in a softer, almost respectful tone of voice. "Few have managed to get so far in such a short time." Harper smiled, trying to hide the pride he felt. After all, every compliment from Alexander was an achievement, proof that he was exceeding the limits of what he expected. However, The way he looked at her, as if there was something more at stake, still made her uneasy. As she finished the final adjustments, Alexander approached again, watching her progress closely. Harper could feel his breathing beside her, which made her hold her breath, trying to maintain concentration. His proximity was so intense that Harper had to fight to maintain her posture, aware that any emotional reaction could compromise her disguise. As soon as the last line of code was adjusted and the system gave a positive response, Harper let out a sigh of relief. The problem was resolved, and the crisis had been averted. She looked at Alexander, who returned her gaze with an expression of approval that, until that moment, he had kept hidden. "Excellent work, Harry," he said, with a faint smile that Harper had never seen before. "I don't know how you did it, but you exceeded expectations." Harper thanked her formally, but Alexander's intense gaze remained on her for a few more seconds, as if he were still searching for an answer to the mystery that Harry represented. Before leaving, he approached one last time, speaking in an almost confidential tone. "You know, Harry, working with you is intriguing." The words, spoken carefully, carried a weight that Harper couldn't ignore. He no longer disguised the interest he felt in discovering who that person in front of him really was. The next morning, Harper found herself exhausted, but the feeling of relief at having managed to keep her secret was temporary. Last night had been a test not only of his technical skills, but of his ability to maintain cover in extreme situations. He knew that Alexander's gaze, always attentive, captured every detail of his actions and reactions, and that he did not seem willing to ignore any hint of mystery. Over the next few days, Alexander became more attentive, and in moments of interaction, his eyes examined Harper in a way that made her even more uncomfortable. He seemed to test her loyalty and limits in almost subtle ways, as if he was waiting for the right moment to confront her once and for all. Harper, for her part, was increasingly alert, trying to maintain control over every aspect of her disguise. But physical and emotional exhaustion was becoming an increasing challenge. Later that week, Alexander called Harper in for a one-on-one meeting. He was waiting for her in his office, his expression serious, but with an intensity that seemed to overflow his usual neutrality. "Harry," he began, his voice calm but with an undertone that suggested something deeper. "I appreciate the level of dedication you've shown, but I want to better understand what motivates you. Because honestly, your performance and commitment are beyond what I normally expect from someone in your position." Harper knew this wasn't just talk about work. He was trying to get closer, to understand who she really was. He felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, knowing that any word or gesture could betray his true identity. "I've always been someone who seeks to learn and grow, sir," he replied, trying to keep his tone as neutral as possible. "Blake Innovations is the opportunity I've always sought, and I want to seize every moment to prove myself." Alexander nodded, but the intensity in his gaze didn't lessen. He seemed to get lost in her words, searching for hidden meanings, trying to understand what motivated her with so much determination. "I understand, Harry," he said finally, but his expression still showed signs of distrust. Harper felt that he was getting closer and closer to getting to the truth, and the tension between them seemed to grow with each conversation. When Harper left the office, she felt a wave of relief but also uneasiness. Alexander was determined to understand who she really was, and she knew that no matter how hard she tried to hide it, the truth was getting closer to being discovered. Silently, she promised herself that she would do whatever it took to keep her secret. But the feeling that Alexander was getting too close to something that couldn't be revealed left her on constant alert. The days that followed were filled with a mixture of tension and small moments of vulnerability, each interaction between them marked by the penetrating gaze of Alexander, who seemed to want to discover what was going on inside Harry. Alexander's invitation came unexpectedly, interrupting Harper's concentration on the code he had been studying for hours. Alexander approached, and in his always calm but authoritative tone, informed her about a programming competition that would bring together some of the best minds in the industry. The Blake Innovations team had been invited to participate, and he wanted Harry to be there, working alongside some of the most respected programmers from other companies. "Consider this an opportunity to show your true potential and the level we are building here," Alexander said, fixing his gaze on Harper with a slight smile of confidence, but also a hint of defiance. He knew that putting Harry in a competition like that would demand the utmost from her, not only in technical skills, but also in emotional control. Harper swallowed hard, but accepted the proposal without hesitation, even though he knew that the competition represented a test that would go far beyond the code. She couldn't deny the nervousness she felt at the thought of being exposed to other teams, and even more so, being watched so closely by Alexander in an environment where he could see her every move without the filters that everyday work offered. She knew that any mistake or suspicious attitude could be the missing detail for him to unmask her. The competition was scheduled for the weekend in a high-tech conference center, with rooms full of state-of-the-art computers and monitors that displayed each team's progress in real time. Upon entering the place, Harper felt her heart speed up. The atmosphere was tense, full of watchful eyes and programmers of all ages and styles, each one seeming to represent an idea of their own genius. The atmosphere was almost intimidating, but also challenging, a stage where she knew she could show what she was capable of doing. Alexander was next to her, and the two waited while the event coordinator explained the rules of the competition. The challenge was complex. Each team had to develop an algorithm capable of analyzing large amounts of data in record time, ensuring maximum precision and security. The task involved not only technical skills, but quick logical thinking and precision in each line of code. As the coordinator spoke, Harper glanced at Alexander, who returned the look with a subtle nod, indicating that he expected the best from her. With the competition underway, Harper dove into the code, typing quickly as his mind focused solely on the problem. She developed the algorithm with surprising precision, each line appearing on the screen with the speed that only years of intense practice could provide. The other programmers around him seemed to keep pace, but not with the same fluidity. The nervousness was palpable in some, while Harper remained calm, almost as if she was isolated from all the pressure around her. Alexander watched her from a distance, his eyes fixed on the figure of Harry as she worked. His calm and determined posture attracted attention. He could see the confidence she exuded with every movement. That intrigued him even more. While the other team members showed signs of fatigue and tension, Harper continued to work with absolute concentration, as if driven by something deeper than the desire to win. After a few hours, the first teams began to complete the challenge, but Harper was still making final adjustments, seeking to maximize the efficiency of the algorithm he had developed. With each line of code I reviewed, the feeling grew that I was on the verge of achieving the perfection that Alexander demanded. Finally, it was finished, and the system was validated with greater performance than expected. The news soon spread among the teams. Harry's algorithm stood out as the fastest and most accurate in the competition. When the result was announced, a wave of applause ran through the room, and Harper felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction. The other programmers began to greet her enthusiastically, some reaching out to shake her in a gesture of respect. But the moment the first colleague approached, extending his hand to shake, Harper hesitated. His mind searched for a quick way out, a way to avoid physical contact without arousing suspicion. But in the brief moment of hesitation, he felt the gazes of Alexander and other colleagues. She quickly covered her tension with a smile and made a light excuse about having a cold and not wanting to pass anything on to the others, discreetly retreating and maintaining a formal posture. But as much as she tried to appear relaxed, the embarrassment and attempt to avoid contact were evident. When she looked at Alexander, she saw that he was watching her with narrowed eyes, evaluating that reaction with even deeper attention. After the competition ended, when all the participants began to disperse, Alexander called Harper for a brief private conversation. "Congratulations on the job, Harry," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a gravity that indicated there was more behind those words. "Your performance was exceptional, but I noticed that you avoided contact with other programmers, even in a moment of celebration. That's not part of the culture we're building here." Harper felt a chill run down her spine. Alexander was indirectly questioning something he had suspected for some time, and the observation was clearly a test. She remained calm, trying to come up with a convincing answer. I'm a bit reserved, sir," he explained, keeping his tone serious. "I always prefer to maintain a certain distance in the professional environment." Alexander watched her for a few moments, his gaze fixed and appraising. "I understand, Harry, but trust between co-workers is essential for any team. I would like you to try to be more accepting in the future. This is important for building a collaborative environment." Those words left Harper on alert, but she nodded, keeping her expression serious. He knew that the answer had only been partially accepted, and that Alexander continued to pay attention to every gesture or reaction. He had tested her, and although she was temporarily pleased with the answer, she knew her confidence was being scrutinized. In the following days, Harper began to avoid at all costs any situation that could raise further suspicion. But Alexander, as if unconvinced, seemed more determined to understand the true reason for Harry's behavior. During the meetings, he observed her with an attention that was beyond simple professional interest, studying every word, every small pause in her answers, looking for some clue that could satisfy his suspicions. On a particularly tense afternoon, Alexander called her into his office to discuss the team's performance. The conversation followed a formal tone, with him commenting on future goals. But the gaze he kept on her was intense, almost invasive. Harper felt increasingly restless, and the pressure to maintain her cover became a constant presence. The moment the meeting ended, Alexander took a brief break and called her again before she left the room. "Harry," he began, his tone almost casual but still full of intention. "Have you ever stopped to think about what really motivates you? It's not common to find someone with your level of dedication. Most young people your age are more concerned with accumulating experience and gaining visibility, but you seem to have something more in mind." Those words resonated in Harper's mind like a warning. Alexander was closer than she imagined, groping for the mystery she tried so hard to hide. "I believe that my motivation lies in the work I do and the pursuit of learning," he replied, trying to sound convincing. "Working at Blake Innovations is the pinnacle of my career. I am driven by the idea of growing and learning from the best." Alexander nodded, but the gleam in his eyes indicated he wasn't completely convinced. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them, and Harper had to fight to maintain her posture in the face of such proximity. "Harry," he began, in a lower tone, "I hope you know that trust is essential to me. Trust is the foundation of any solid partnership, so I need to know that I can count on you completely." Harper felt the impact of those words as a kind of silent provocation. Alexander seemed to send a clear message. He wanted to know who Harry really was. She nodded, keeping her expression serious, but her heart was beating fast, as if every second before him was a battle against her own disguise. After that meeting, Harper realized the situation was becoming untenable. Alexander was getting closer and closer to figuring something out, and she felt more and more pressured to respond with an honesty she couldn't offer. However, he knew that to earn Alexander's respect and trust, he needed to continue demonstrating competence and dedication. When she finally left the room, the air felt lighter, but she knew it was only a momentary victory. Alexander watched her with an intensity that left no doubt. He would continue trying to discover her secret. The Blake Innovations get-together event was planned to be one of the biggest of the year. The company had organized a luxurious party in an elegant ballroom of a hotel in the city center, complete with refined decor and an environment that exuded a cold and calculated sophistication, exactly like the company's image of perfection. Harper never liked these kinds of social events, where formalities and small talk mixed with alcohol and forced laughter. But as Harry, he knew he couldn't refuse. He dressed simply, keeping his disguise discreet, and arrived at the hall, carefully observing the faces that mixed as more colleagues and company directors arrived. She tried to stay away, as always, avoiding getting involved in conversations that required excessive social presence. But that night, something felt different. Alexander, who usually kept to himself, was more sociable, walking around and interacting with several employees. He smiled more than usual, offered greetings, and every now and then cast glances in Harper's direction, glances that seemed to weigh on her like silent questions. As the night progressed, the formal atmosphere gave way to a more relaxed atmosphere, and conversations became looser, as did the laughter that mixed with the soft music that filled the environment. Some employees approached Harper, offering her drinks, and she hesitantly accepted a glass of wine so as not to arouse suspicion. She was trying to sip the drink slowly, but the pressure of the moment, combined with the need to appear casual, caused her to drink a little more than she intended. The minutes passed, and the drink took effect, warming his face and making the environment more hazy. At some point, Harper realized that Alexander was closer. He had approached her with a glass in hand and a friendly expression she rarely saw at work. "Harry," he greeted you, in a tone that seemed more personal than usual, as if just the two of you were there. "I hope you're enjoying the party." Harper smiled and nodded, trying to stay alert, but the drink was already affecting his reflexes. Alexander watched her with a subtle but persistent attention, and Harper felt that the alcohol was weakening her barriers, making every word and every movement harder to control. It was as if his presence became more intense under the influence of the drink, and she realized that she was vulnerable, more than she would have liked. He tried to keep the conversation casual, but his drunken mind resisted maintaining the carefully constructed disguise. At one point, as they talked, Harper mentioned something without thinking, a reference to his college and the way he had fallen in love with programming at a young age. She felt the slip as soon as the words escaped, but she wasn't quick enough to stop them. Alexander raised his eyebrows, clearly intrigued. "Funny, Harry," he commented with an enigmatic smile. "I never heard you talk about your life before you came here." Harper tried to hide it, shaking her head as if to dismiss the remark, but Alexander wasn't going to let her off the hook so easily. He tilted his head, his eyes fixed on her, as if trying to penetrate whatever layer she still retained. "Where did you really come from?" The question was simple, but it carried a weight that Harper felt vibrating in her stomach. She smiled uncertainly, searching for a vague answer, but the wine was making her thoughts slower, her words more disorganized. I don't like talking about the past," he murmured, trying to divert the conversation. But Alexander seemed to hear the vulnerability in her voice, and his gaze took on a tone of concerned curiosity. "I understand, but it's hard to build trust with someone who insists on being a mystery," he said, in a tone that sounded closer and more sincere than any conversation they'd ever had. Harper felt her heart racing, struggling to maintain her composure as the barriers she had held so tightly to her knees threatened to crumble. She looked away, trying to move away from the weight of that moment, but the wine and Alexander's deep gaze made everything around her seem distorted, like a slowly moving scenery, as her thoughts became exposed and disorganized. Before he could react, he felt his legs tremble slightly, and Alexander, attentive, noticed his discomfort and reached out his hand. "Harry, you don't look well. Let me take you home." Harper tried to refuse, but Alexander's proximity and the effect of alcohol made any resistance almost impossible. She just nodded, allowing him to guide her out of the room and towards the car he had parked near the venue. The ride was silent, and Harper kept looking out the window, trying to regain control of her thoughts. Yet Alexander's proximity to the wheel, the concentration with which he watched her glance at her, made every second a reminder of the vulnerable situation in which she found herself. She felt caught between the desire to explain something and the need to protect herself, but exhaustion and alcohol seemed to combine to create a confusing fog in her mind. When they finally arrived at the address, she had mentioned the small apartment she had temporarily rented for Harry. Alexander helped her out of the car, his hand firm on her arm, holding her with a gentleness she had never imagined. The firmness of that touch brought her back to momentary lucidity, and she instinctively pulled away, still trying to protect her identity. But the look he gave her was different, filled with silent concern, mixed with a curiosity that Harper didn't know how to interpret. "Harry," he murmured as they walked slowly towards the building's entrance, "I need to understand. There's something about you that always seems to run away when I'm around, like you're hiding something important." Alexander's words hit her with an unexpected intensity, and Harper, still under the influence of the wine, felt the weight of the lie threatening to crumble. She stopped, turning to him, and Alexander's eyes captured hers with an intensity that seemed to question everything she tried to hide. Alexander," she began, and the familiar tone of her voice, for once, didn't sound like Harry's. The words that escaped her lips carried a vulnerability that she had never let on. Alexander seemed to notice the change, and an expression of surprise and understanding appeared on his face. "Harry, or whoever you are," he said, in an almost hesitant tone, as if he didn't want to believe what his suspicions were beginning to reveal. "Why so reserved? Why hide like that?" Harper felt a latent pain in his chest, a conflict between admiration and the guilt he felt at being there, in front of him, with his identity just a hair away from being discovered. "Alexander, you wouldn't understand. I just wanted to do my job," he murmured, looking away to hide the sheen of tears forming in his eyes. The vulnerability, aggravated by the drink, seemed to slip through his fingers, impossible to contain. Alexander approached, looking at her with an understanding she hadn't expected. "I may understand more than you think," he said softly, and Harper realized that his tone was filled with suppressed emotion, something he also seemed to hold inside. His face was close to hers, and for a moment, Harper felt like the defenses they both maintained dissolved. She felt an unbearable desire to tell the truth, to reveal who she was, but fear and insecurity paralyzed her. The silence between them was thick and deep, as if they were both suspended between revelation and uncertainty. Alexander was still watching her, and Harper felt that, for the first time, he saw her in a real way, as if he could see through the layers of Harry to the essence of who she really was. For a moment, everything seemed possible, as if she could be accepted by him, as if this was the right moment to finally show who she was. But before she could say anything, a wave of fear stopped her, bringing back her awareness of the consequences that the truth would bring. Taking a deep breath, Harper looked away and murmured, her voice shaky, "I'm sorry, Alexander. It's not something I can explain. Not now." He didn't press, but the look he gave her made it clear that this wouldn't be the end of the conversation. "I knew that Alexander was getting closer and closer to the truth, but at the same time, I felt that he was trying to respect her limits, as if he was waiting for the right moment to understand what was really going on." The farewell was brief and silent, and Harper stood in the doorway, watching as Alexander walked away, his gaze still fixed on her until the last moment. She felt the weight of that goodbye as a foreshadowing of what was to come, an imminent rupture between what she needed to hide and what he insisted on discovering. Alexander couldn't get the last night out of his mind. The expression of Harry, or, as he began to suspect, of that person who had shown him such unexpected fragility, had been playing in his mind since the moment he left her on the doorstep. There was something, an incomplete truth behind that look, a sheen of tears that indicated much more than an exhausted young programmer trying to maintain a low-profile life. Something profound that escaped between the lines of Harry's careful responses and always measured movements. Alexander, instinctively averse to being deceived, could not resist the urge to investigate further. With the dark morning enveloping his office, Alexander typed in some commands and accessed Harry Williams' information in the company's internal system. He wanted to believe that the suspicions were unfounded, that he was just confused by accumulated fatigue. But with each detail he analyzed, the feeling of uneasiness increased. The record was impeccable, too much so. Even the educational and professional records were perfect, the history of studies and activities documented down to the last line. However, when exploring the database in more depth, he detected an unusual pattern. There was an inconsistency in the timeline, a small alignment error between course dates and the final presentation of qualifications. The burst of doubt became a growing conviction that led him to question everything he knew about his employee. He searched other databases, searched university records and CV databases, and, after a meticulous search, found what he didn't want. There was no one named Harry Williams with the history and details that appeared in the company's system. The silence of the office seemed to absorb the impact of that discovery as Alexander, with his eyes fixed on the screen, tried to process the revelation. His heart was pounding, and the feeling of betrayal intensified with every second. He had allowed this person closer than he had ever let any other employee, even without realizing it. I had begun to respect Harry, to admire him for his commitment, for the passion he put into his work. for the sharp intelligence that he rarely found in someone of that age. But it had all been built on a lie, a fraud he couldn't understand. Anger boiled inside him, and the need to confront it became irresistible. The next day, Alexander arrived at the office earlier than usual, awaiting Harry's arrival with a mixture of frustration and impatience. When Harper finally entered, still in his careful disguise, he called out to her in a harsh, direct tone. His expression, usually controlled and reserved, was now one of pure intensity. "Harry," he said, his voice icy, "I need to talk to you. Now in my office." Harper felt his entire body tense. Something was wrong. Alexander's gaze was hard, like she had never seen before. He tried to remain calm, but each step towards the office seemed to weigh tons, and the feeling that something serious was about to happen tightened his chest like an invisible chain. As soon as she entered and the door closed behind her, Alexander began to speak, his voice filled with an indignation that he didn't even make an effort to hide. "Harry Williams, or whoever you are," he said, the harshness of the words cutting like a blade. "It seems you have a skill I didn't know about. Deceiving people, pretending to be someone you're not, and he managed to fool me long enough." Harper stood frozen, her face draining of color, unable to respond. Alexander looked at her with a mixture of anger and hurt, his eyes shining with what seemed to be a personal wound. "I went to the bottom of your file and found nothing. Nothing that matched the person I thought I was hiring. So please explain to me why someone like you would enter my company under a false identity." The shock Harper felt made her lose her speech for a moment, but she knew she couldn't run away. He felt despair growing inside him, and with a trembling voice, he tried to explain himself. "Alexander, I never wanted to deceive anyone. I just wanted an opportunity. I just wanted to show my work." Her voice, now without the deep tone she used to maintain her disguise, revealed the truth she had hidden for so long. "An opportunity?" Alexander repeated, his voice filled with irony and pain. "Do you think you can just invent a character and step into the shoes that others have honestly tried to achieve? Do you have any idea how offensive this is? How humiliating is it for me to know that I was deceived?" His words were like knives, digging deep into Harper's heart. She felt the world spinning around her, but she knew she needed to be honest. "I know it feels wrong, and I take the blame for it. But Alexander, you know how things are in this area. I studied. I worked as hard as anyone else here. But I knew I would never have a real chance if I were myself. I knew you wouldn't hire a woman for a position like that." Alexander watched her with an expression of disbelief, his jaw clenched as he tried to process the magnitude of this revelation. "So for you, the best solution was to lie to me? Create a farce and manipulate the entire team to get what you wanted? I can't believe you had the audacity to do that. Not here. Not with me." Harper felt tears threatening to spill over, but she kept her voice steady, knowing this moment was crucial. "Alexander, I know this was wrong. I know you have every right to be furious. But all I wanted was a chance to show what I'm capable of. I wanted to be where I could learn and grow. You need to believe that I never wanted to disrespect you, and I have always admired your work, your company. I did all this out of respect for what you built." Alexander let out a bitter laugh, unable to hide his sarcasm. "Respect? Do you think respect is something that is built with lies? You invaded my company, infiltrated my team, and still want to justify it as a show of admiration?" He watched her with an intensity that seemed capable of penetrating the deepest layers of her being. Harper felt like he was on the verge of breaking down, his chest heavy with the weight of guilt and regret. She stepped forward, reaching out instinctively, but Alexander stepped back, his gaze cold and uncompromising. "Please, Alexander," she begged, her voice breaking, "let me stay. I promise that I can be loyal, that I can make a difference here. I know I messed up, but I can't imagine being anywhere else. I just wanted a chance to be a part of it." Alexander remained silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that was both painful and unfathomable. Harper felt her heart race as every second that passed seemed to widen the gulf between them. "You left me with no choices, Harper," he said, his voice cold and final. "I don't know what to believe anymore. The person I thought I knew doesn't exist. The Harry that I respected, that I believed was a prodigy with his whole life ahead of him, it was all a lie. And now I find myself facing a woman I don't know, A woman who used my company and my trust as a springboard to realize her ambitions. Harper felt her chest tighten when she heard those words. The pain in Alexander's eyes was a reflection of all the disappointment and hurt she knew she had caused, and the guilt gnawed at her. "Please," she insisted, her voice barely above a whisper, "let me stay. I beg you, Alexander. I can work even harder. Prove that I am worthy of this position. I can do this without any disguise, without lies. I only ask for a second chance." Alexander looked at her for a few more moments, his eyes filled with a deep and resigned sadness. "I can't trust you, Harper," he said finally, each word heavy with the weight of an irrevocable decision. "You took something from me, something that I considered fundamental, trust, and without that, there is no basis for us to continue." Those words fell upon Harper like a final sentence, and she felt the ground collapse beneath her feet. That was the end. The opportunity she had built with so much effort, the place she had fought and dreamed of, everything was crumbling before her. She tried to speak, but words failed her, and when she saw Alexander walk away, she felt torn apart, as if an essential part of herself was being ripped away. Alexander opened the door, indicating that she should leave, but before she could move, he spoke once again, in a low and almost imperceptible tone, as if there was still a trace of feeling in his voice. "The worst thing, Harper, is that I believed you. I saw potential. I saw something that could be great. But everything I see now is a sham, and there is nothing more devastating than believing someone and finding out it was all a lie." Harper left the office, her eyes teary, her heart pounding with intense pain. He knew that he had lost not only his job, but Alexander's respect, something he had never imagined he valued so much until that moment. The walk to leave the company was long and lonely, and each step was a cruel reminder of what I had risked, of the price I would now have to pay. The night was long for Alexander. After the confrontation with Harper, he was alone in the office, still processing the flood of emotions that hit him with unexpected intensity. The anger at the mistake, the disappointment at realizing that Harry, the young prodigy he had begun to admire and respect, had never actually existed, and above all, the deep sense of betrayal. The image of Harper, fragile and vulnerable when admitting the truth, insisted on invading his thoughts, even when he tried to push it away with rational coldness. But he couldn't deny that her courage to admit the truth and her desperate plea for a second chance affected him more deeply than he cared to admit. He tried to convince himself that letting her go was the right decision, that any other choice would demonstrate weakness and unconsciousness. However, for the next few hours, a persistent thought haunted him. Harper wasn't just anyone. She had stood out, overcome all challenges, and demonstrated a determination and talent that, even in the midst of lies, were not fake. The truth was that he had never seen anyone work with so much passion, and even with the discovery, he felt that, somehow, she was still the same person with whom he had shared nights of work and long discussions of ideas. Harper had won that seat on his own merits, albeit under a false identity, and no matter how hard he tried, Alexander knew it would be difficult to find someone with the same potential. The next morning, still absorbed in contradictory thoughts, he found himself reviewing the projects Harper had developed over the past few months, noting how each line of code demonstrated the precision and complexity with which she thought. The frustration over the breach of trust continued to simmer, but as he analyzed her work, he realized how deeply Harper's intelligence and effort were intertwined with the success they were achieving. After long reflection, an idea began to take shape, although it went against everything he had ever believed about integrity and trust. Convinced that he needed one more conversation before making any final decisions, Alexander asked his assistant to call Harper and ask her to come to his office. Harper received the call with her heart pounding. She hadn't expected to have any kind of new chance, much less an audience with Alexander. Hearing the formal, distant tone of his voice on the phone, he felt a knot of anxiety form in his stomach. He walked to the office with slow, hesitant steps, fearing that this was just a call to formalize his dismissal. When he entered, he found Alexander sitting at his desk, his face more serious than ever, but not as cold as last time. He watched her enter, and Harper felt the weight of that gaze, so attentive and impenetrable that it seemed to penetrate any attempt at defense. "Harper," he began, in a firm tone, "Sit down." She obeyed, her mind spinning with the uncertainty of not knowing what he would say next. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on her, as if trying to gauge each reaction. "I spent the night reflecting on what happened, and to be honest, I'm torn. You broke one of the cardinal rules for me, trust, and that, Harper, is not something you recover easily." Harper looked down, feeling guilt rising in her chest. She knew Alexander had every reason to doubt her, but the pain of hearing it directly was intense. However, Alexander continued in a more measured tone, "But I also know how to recognize talent, and like everyone here, I'm a practical person. Your work has been of great value to the company, and I can't ignore that. In some way, you've proven yourself, even if in a way that I will never accept it as ethics." He paused, as if the next words were not yet completely clear even to him. "I'm willing to consider a second chance for you, Harper, but under specific and severe conditions. There will be no more excuses, no more lies. Any slip up, no matter how small, and you're out." Harper looked up, surprised and moved, but without the courage to show her relief. "I understand," she replied, her voice breaking. I can't express how much this means to me, Alexander. I will honor this opportunity, I swear." He nodded, but his gaze remained firm and impassive, as if he still harbored a barrier of distrust that would be difficult to overcome. "There are conditions you must accept," Alexander continued. "From now on, all projects you develop will be under my direct control. I need to see with my own eyes that your commitment is real. Any important decision involving your work will be approved in advance by me, and I will be monitoring closely its performance." Harper listened intently, accepting each word with a seriousness that he could see on her face. "Also," he added, "you will be responsible for training new team members. I want you to teach everything you know, and at the same time, I want to see how you handle passing on your knowledge. We'll see if you can act with integrity and respect for others." Harper nodded again, each condition reinforcing the weight of the new responsibility, but also igniting a spark of determination in her heart. She knew this was her chance at redemption, the opportunity to prove her worth beyond the facade she had created. "As Harry, I accept all conditions, Alexander. I will do my best to regain your trust." The new routine began the following week, and Harper dove into the new projects with renewed vigor, determined to follow each of the conditions that Alexander had established. He monitored her closely, analyzing her decisions, intervening when necessary, and insisting that she explain each technical choice in detail, as if trying to map not only her skills, but also the character behind each line of code. Alexander, in turn, felt intrigued by Harper's stance. Despite the distrust he maintained, he could not ignore the growing respect he developed for her. Harper demonstrated a discipline and intensity that he rarely saw in other professionals. Even under pressure, she remained firm, and each project they worked on together revealed a creativity that surprised him. She brought innovative solutions, suggested complex ideas, and faced problems in an unusual way, as if her mind was always 2 steps ahead. During meetings, he observed her in silence, capturing nuances in the way she explained the projects, in how she presented problems and solutions. Her voice, now natural and without layers of disguise, sounded more sincere and passionate, and Alexander, little by little, found himself increasingly impressed not only by the work, but by the courage and vulnerability that Harper demonstrated. He could see that her determination went beyond simple ambition. Harper was fighting for something he didn't yet fully understand, but whose intensity touched him in unexpected ways. As the weeks went by, the tension between them began to dissipate, and a new dynamic of respect and admiration began to be established. Alexander found himself, against his own will, increasingly attentive to the details of Harper's personality, the way she dedicated herself to each task, the way her eyes sparkled when solving a complex problem. It was as if, with each new project, he discovered another layer of that enigmatic person who had invaded his space. Little by little, Alexander's views began to change, no longer just being evaluative and critical, but becoming almost admiring. In moments of pause, he found himself watching Harper with restrained fascination, capturing subtle details of her personality, like the small smile she gave when solving a challenge, or the determined gleam that appeared in her eyes when defending an idea. It was a transformation he had never expected, but it made him realize that there was something more between them than simple professionalism. Harper, in turn, also noticed the change. Every time he looked at Alexander, he felt a mixture of respect and something he didn't dare admit, but that was beginning to grow in his heart. The intense interaction, the hours dedicated to each project, and the weight of trying to regain her confidence made her realize that there was a depth in his eyes, an empathy that she didn't imagine he could show. The barrier that Alexander maintained, no matter how firm it was, seemed to slowly dissipate. However, despite the feelings they were both beginning to harbor, neither of them allowed themselves to cross that invisible line. The emotional tension between them was almost palpable, like a shared secret that, although never expressed in words, hung in the air. Harper knew he still had a long way to go before he completely regained Alexander's trust, and Alexander, in turn, tried with all his might to remain distant and impassive, even though he increasingly found himself admired for his courage and for Harper's talent. The work between the two continued intensely, each project a new step in the construction of something that they both knew was important, although they were not yet ready to admit the true meaning of it. The trip was planned to seal a new contract with a partner company that would significantly expand Blake Innovations' artificial intelligence projects. The contract was critical, and Alexander had decided to bring Harper in as a key part of the negotiating team. He wanted her to present the technical solutions and demonstrate the depth of the capabilities they had created together. Over the past few months, it was an opportunity to consolidate the trust that was beginning to be re-established between them, but also a chance for her to definitively prove her worth. The ride to San Francisco was silent. Harper, absorbed by the responsibility she carried, tried to concentrate on what she was going to present, but the physical proximity to Alexander made her heart beat at a rapid pace. They were both in business class on the plane, separated only by the narrow aisle, and at several moments, their eyes accidentally met, resulting in a mix of embarrassment and familiarity. She felt the weight of those brief encounters, but she didn't dare prolong them. Even with the new feelings that had arisen, I knew that the focus should be on work. The tension only increased when, during the presentation at the partner company's headquarters, she realized that Alexander was paying attention to every word, observing her with a look that transcended the professional. The way he studied her, paying attention to the smallest details, almost left her exposed, as if he were able to read every hesitation or nuance in her answers. He seemed to be there not only to support the negotiation, but also to analyze how Harper handled the pressure and demonstrated his experience. The meeting was a success, and the contract was closed, but the work was far from over. As they left the building, Alexander suggested that they celebrate at dinner, something that Harper didn't dare refuse, despite feeling the mixture of excitement and fear growing even more. She knew it would be a special occasion and tried to maintain her composure, even as her mind revolved around the closeness that dinner promised. They sat in a discreet and elegant restaurant, where the atmosphere invited more intimate conversations. The hours passed at a light pace. The conversation flowed between trivial matters, work memories, and some confessions about the difficulties they faced in achieving the success of that presentation. Alexander was looser than usual, and Harper, enveloped in that new side he showed, felt more at ease, even with the weight of the feelings she tried to repress. At one point, as they clinked glasses of wine, Alexander looked at her in a way that made her feel strangely vulnerable. He was looking at her with an intensity that carried something beyond professional admiration. "You surprised me, Harper," he said, his tone softer than usual. "These last few months, I didn't know someone could work with so much passion, even after everything that happened between us." Harper, still trying to maintain control, smiled modestly. "Working here means a lot to me, and despite everything, it's where I've always wanted to be." The words escaped her almost like a confession, and she quickly looked down at her glass of wine, trying to hide the embarrassment she felt. The silence that followed was full of unspoken meanings, of feelings and thoughts that both avoided expressing. Harper felt his face heat up, and for a moment, He wished the night would end so he could get out of that dense atmosphere full of undeniable desires. But at the same time, I felt like I didn't want that moment to end. Alexander's presence was magnetic, and she knew that, no matter how much she tried to deny it, a part of her was hopelessly drawn to him. After dinner, Alexander accompanied her to the hotel, where they each had their own room reserved. In the elevator, they were both silent, side by side, and Harper felt the tension in the air grow with each floor they climbed. The silence was thick with the weight of what neither of them dared admit. When the elevator stopped on Harper's floor, she started to get out, but Alexander held the door for a brief moment. "Harper," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, "I know our working relationship is complicated, but these past few months have shown me that you're someone I'm still trying to understand." His words, loaded with implicit meaning, sank deep into Harper. She looked at him, torn between the pride she was trying to maintain and the uncontrollable attraction she felt. Something in those eyes, which had always seemed suspicious and uncompromising, now displayed a vulnerability that surprised her and made her question everything she thought she knew about him. Before he could respond, the elevator closed its doors and continued on its way to his floor. Harper stood in the hallway, her heart racing, as she tried to process what had just happened. There was something in Alexander's eyes, a softness that she had never imagined seeing, and that made it even more difficult to deal with what she felt. It was as if that layer of professionalism had been momentarily peeled away, revealing an Alexander she didn't know, an Alexander who seemed to want to get closer in a way he had never allowed. However, Harper knew that feeling carried dangers. Alexander was her boss, the man who had given her a second chance, and yet she felt like she was getting more and more involved in something that could end in pain. She tried to push the idea away, but at the same time, she knew that, no matter how much she tried to deny it, her mind constantly returned to that look, to the way he had looked at her, and to all the conversations they had shared since he discovered her. The next morning, work continued with the same intensity. They needed to review contract details and adjust the last points before returning to headquarters. During the trip back, the atmosphere between them oscillated between the seriousness of the work and brief moments of distraction, in which Harper felt that Alexander's gaze fell on her differently, as if he were evaluating not only her capabilities, but something more. The hours passed, and the silence between them was interrupted only by brief comments about the progress of the contract or some professional observation. But Harper felt that there was a fine line that they both avoided crossing. It was as if every unspoken word, every look exchanged, was a reminder of what was taking place between them, and that, even without admitting it, they both understood. When they arrived in the city, Alexander accompanied her to the office to finalize the documents, and the atmosphere seemed heavier than ever. Sitting face to face at the table, as they signed the last pages, Harper felt the weight of tiredness and the emotions he was trying to suppress. At one point, she looked up and found Alexander's gaze fixed on hers, an expression that brimmed with something between admiration and hesitation. "Harper," he said, in a softer, almost intimate tone, as if they were the final words of an unfinished conversation, "if I said that these months have made me rethink a lot of things, would you understand what I mean?" Harper stood frozen, thoughts swirling in her mind as she tried to come up with an answer. "I knew what he meant. I felt the same way, but the weight of reality imposed itself, a line that neither of them could cross without consequences." But before he could respond, he looked away, as if realizing the impossibility of that conversation, and continued to work in silence, ending the moment before it became any deeper. When they finally said goodbye, Harper left the office with her heart racing and her mind confused. She knew that, no matter how much she tried to stay focused on her work, something inside her had changed irrevocably. Something that made every day at Alexander's side a constant challenge, a struggle between reason and what her heart insisted on feeling. However, she also knew that, at that moment, the best thing she could do was keep these feelings to herself and move on, focusing on what really mattered, her work and the trust that Alexander placed in her, even if it was a trust that they both knew it would never be completely restored. The days following the trip were filled with a tense silence between Alexander and Harper. Back in the company's routine, both tried to refocus on their projects, but the closeness they had shared during the trip seemed to interfere with each interaction. Harper struggled to focus solely on her work, telling herself that all she cared about was proving herself as a professional. But she knew something had changed. The relationship between them had transformed. There was now a subtext in the conversations, a hesitation in the glances exchanged that hinted at hidden feelings, ready to emerge at any moment. One afternoon, Alexander asked her to meet him in his office to discuss the next steps of the newly signed contract. Harper entered, carrying a folder of notes, and found Alexander engrossed in his computer screen. He seemed more tense than usual, his shoulders rigid, his gaze lost on an invisible point as he waited for her to begin speaking. But as Harper began to explain the revision of the clauses, the tension in his expression increased until finally he interrupted her, the tone of his voice more cutting than she had ever heard it. "Harper," he began, keeping his gaze steady, but his voice filled with an anger he couldn't disguise. "We need to clarify something. I don't know if you realize, but your presence here, day after day, is becoming complicated." The words came out with difficulty, and Harper froze momentarily, feeling a mixture of confusion and indignation. She couldn't understand where that tone came from, but something inside her rebelled. She had spent months trying to rebuild his trust, bending to his demands and accepting the strict conditions imposed. And now, that accusatory tone, that cold expression, made everything seem unfair. "Excuse me, Alexander," she replied, keeping her voice steady, but pain and anger flickering in her gaze. "I believe I'm fulfilling my role, dedicating myself more than necessary. I don't know what you mean by that." Her words had a challenging tone to them, something he hadn't expected. During all that time, she had accepted the conditions and maintained her stance, but now, she felt that she could no longer remain silent. Alexander sighed, looking away for a moment before answering her. "What I mean," he said, voice lower but still filled with intensity, "is that there's no denying what's going on between us, Harper. And you know that as much as I do." The silence that followed was thick, and Harper felt her heart speed up, a wave of contradictory emotions rising in her chest. Finally, the truth they both avoided was exposed, but the weight of it made everything even more confusing. "Alexander, Harper tried to formulate a response, but words failed him. The vulnerability she felt prevented her from maintaining her composure. The emotional closeness they had been developing, the respect they slowly rebuilt, the affection and admiration that blossomed in the midst of distrust. Everything seemed to culminate in that moment, making it impossible to control what he felt. And when she saw Alexander's face so close, as human and hurt as her own, something inside her gave way. Without thinking, Harper took a step forward, the distance between them now minimal. She felt his breathing. Every tense line on Alexander's face seemed to call for a surrender, a truce that they both longed for and feared. He looked at her, eyes intense, as the tension building between them exploded into uncontained need. On impulse, Alexander cupped Harper's face, and their lips met. The kiss was intense, filled with everything they had avoided and repressed during those months. There was a mixture of anger, desire, and an almost painful relief at finally giving in to what they both knew was inevitable. Alexander's hand, firm, ran over her face, while Harper felt her body give into the proximity, her heart beating in an uncontrolled rhythm. The world around them disappeared, and for a moment, nothing else mattered other than what they were experiencing. But the moment was brief. Harper felt Alexander pull away, breaking the kiss, and saw his expression turn into a mix of surprise and conflict. Alexander took a step back, running a hand over his face as if trying to organize his thoughts, his breathing still ragged. He looked at her, his eyes expressing an internal battle that she couldn't fully decipher. This shouldn't have happened," he murmured, his voice filled with tension and guilt. That sentence was like a blade. Harper felt the impact of the words and stepped back, trying to process what he had just said. He seemed distant, already wrapped in an emotional barrier that excluded her. as if the kiss had broken a dangerous and irreversible line. "Alexander," she began, but he interrupted her, raising his hand. "Harper, I can't," he said, the tone final. "This could ruin everything. My job, your career. It's not something we can ignore." His face was hardened, as if he had already made the decision and was determined to stick to it. Harper felt a mix of pain and frustration, realizing that, despite everything they had experienced, he was once again choosing to maintain the distances and barriers he had built over the years. Before she could insist or voice any objection, Alexander looked away and turned toward the window, his posture indicating that the matter was closed. "Starting tomorrow, I'm transferring you to another team. I still have respect for your work, Harper, but we can't continue working together." The words were direct, but Harper realized that behind that decision was a mixture of pain and conflict. He didn't want it to be like this, but he was determined. Harper felt a wave of revolt wash over him. It was as if, even after everything, Alexander was unwilling to acknowledge what they felt, and the idea of being pushed away, as if it were something disposable, hurt her deeply. She looked at him, her voice shaking with mixed emotions. "So that's it," she said, anger and sadness overflowing in her voice. "After everything, you choose to just walk away?" Alexander turned to her, eyes cold, but conflict still visible in his expression. "It's not a matter of easy choice, Harper, but it's a matter of responsibility. My responsibility to the company and to what I've built here. I can't let one feeling get in the way of everything that took me years to build." His words sounded like a blow, and Harper realized that, at that moment, any attempt to convince him would be futile. Alexander had made his decision, and nothing he said would change the fact that he had chosen to protect his pride and his reputation, rather than give space to how they felt. Harper fought to hold back the tears, keeping her posture steady as she nodded slowly. "I understand," she replied, her voice low and controlled. "Thank you for everything, Alexander. I will fulfill my duties in the new team." Without waiting for another response, Harper left the room, leaving behind the weight of an implicit goodbye that suffocated her. As he closed the door, he felt the tears finally flow, each step he took echoing the pain of a separation that seemed definitive. Over the next few days, Harper was moved to a different section, away from Alexander's line of sight. The new team was made up of talented programmers, but the work didn't have the same purpose or challenge that had previously motivated them. She felt lost, as if despite her skill and dedication, she was relegated to a secondary position. However, he continued to perform his tasks with the same commitment, aware that he could not let the pain interfere with his work. Alexander, in turn, tried to focus on projects and the company's growth, but constantly felt Harper's absence. The void left by her was a constant presence that tormented him, and no matter how much he tried to focus on work, he knew that something had broken. The distance between them, instead of resolving the conflicts he imagined, only seemed to intensify what he felt. During meetings and events, he found himself looking for her, hoping to see her at the entrance to the office. But each time he remembered his decision, he forced himself to push those thoughts away, convincing himself that he had done the right thing. However, the barrier that had been erected between the two did not prevent the feelings from persisting. In moments of silence, Alexander found himself reliving the moment their lips met, the taste of that kiss, the intensity of the touch. That brief delivery still resonated in his mind, and even though he tried to ignore it, he knew that nothing had erased what he felt. Harper, on the other hand, tried to move on, but each morning at the office, each project developed, brought back memories of Alexander and everything they had experienced. His departure, although painful, had strengthened her pride and determination, and she knew that, even with her heart hurt, she would continue to prove her worth, even if she was far from him. The days following Harper's move to another team were painfully long. Work, which once seemed like a motivating challenge, had become a burden. Each morning, Harper tried to recommit himself to his position, but the truth was that he felt like he was living a purposeless routine. The distance Alexander imposed had torn her apart in ways she would never admit out loud. But day after day, it became more evident that she no longer found room to grow there, The environment that had inspired her so much now seemed devoid of life. The new projects were interesting, but not as engaging as the ones she and Alexander had built together. She realized with each line of code and meeting that, without the creative tension and intense exchange of ideas they shared, the work had become almost mechanical. And no matter how hard he tried, the feelings he had for Alexander didn't dissipate. They hovered over her like a persistent shadow, bringing a constant pain, a longing for what they never had the courage to live. It was one Friday morning that Harper finally made a decision. She felt worn out, emotionally and professionally. She had tried, in vain, to stay focused on her career within Blake Innovations, but she realized that, as long as she remained at that company, the wounds of rejection and her feelings for Alexander would prevent her from moving forward. It was clear to her that she needed to find a new path, a place where she could start over without the constant memories of him, without the invisible barriers that Alexander had erected between the two of them. With a heavy heart, he composed his resignation letter, weighing each word carefully. She knew the decision wouldn't be easy, but she was determined not to go back. When he finished writing, he felt a wave of relief mixed with fear of the unknown. He took a deep breath and, with the letter in his hands, went to Alexander's office. I wanted to deliver the letter in person. As painful as it was, I needed to take this step with dignity. When he entered, he found him leaning over the table, focused on documents. Harper was silent, waiting until he looked up. When he finally noticed her, he saw Alexander's eyes take on a surprised and slightly wary expression. "Harper, to what do I owe your visit?" he asked without breaking his intense and serious gaze. She felt her heart race, but she kept her expression steady. "I came to hand in my letter of resignation," Harper said, holding out the envelope, unable to hide the hesitation in his voice. "I believe it's the best for both. I have a lot of respect for the company and everything we've built here, but I need to move on." The words escaped, but the pain of saying them was evident. Each sentence carried with the weight of the memories they shared and the feelings that still persisted. Alexander remained silent, his eyes fixed on the letter in his hand, his expression falling as if he were absorbing the impact of the news. After a moment, he sat back in his chair, keeping his gaze on Harper, but revealing nothing more than a coldness that seemed to contain something much deeper. "Harper, you are one of the most important parts of this project. I can't just accept your dismissal as if it were any detail. It will impact everything we are building." Harper didn't expect that answer. He was looking at her with an intensity that confused her. Behind the serious expression, there was a tension that she knew was related to what he had not yet been able to express. "Alexander," she began, trying to remain calm, "I know it's a sudden decision, but I feel exhausted. This situation has been complicated for me. Staying here means dealing with feelings that hurt me every day." Harper looked away, feeling vulnerability cut through her like a blade. It was a revelation she had kept to herself, but at the same time, it was the truth that supported her decision. Alexander remained silent for a long moment. He seemed to be fighting an internal battle, and Harper could see the tension that appeared on his face as he processed those words. Finally, he stood up, crossing his arms and walking around the room with a restrained but intense air. "Do you really believe that leaving the company will resolve how you feel?" He looked at her, and his intense gaze hit her, almost as if he could see through every layer she tried to maintain. "Yes," she replied, her voice soft but determined. "Being here, seeing you every day, pretending everything is fine, is a weight I can no longer carry." Harper looked up at Alexander, who now seemed even more closed off, his expression unreadable. Finally, he stopped, his jaw tense but not looking away from her. "Harper, I can't allow you to leave. I know my decision to remove you was harsh, and I understand that you feel uncomfortable about it. But the truth is that you are indispensable to this project." There was a tone of sincerity in his voice, something that transcended the professional. "What you and I have built here is rare, and it would be a mistake to waste all your talent." She felt the weight of his words and realized that, despite the distance he had imposed, there was something in Alexander that didn't want to let her go. "Alexander, I appreciate that you value my work, but that doesn't change how I'm feeling." Harper's voice shook slightly, and she felt like every word was a blow against the wall she had built to protect herself. "This company was my dream, but circumstances have changed. I need peace, and that's not something I can find here." Alexander looked at her intensely, her every word penetrating his mind like a truth he didn't want to admit. "Harper, I understand what you're saying. I know I acted harshly, that I made decisions that probably made you feel devalued, but I can't allow you to leave the company because of something that is temporary." He hesitated, and she noticed the difficulty he had in verbalizing what he felt. Harper took a deep breath, trying to keep herself steady. "It's not something temporary, Alexander. These are feelings that I carried for too long. I dedicated myself. I tried to be strong, but now I need to think about myself." She knew that, for him, accepting the decision of a valued employee was almost impossible, but she also knew that she could no longer give in to his insistence. She needed to be true to herself. Alexander's eyes flickered with controlled anger, mixed with a pain he tried to hide. He took a deep breath, as if trying to dissipate the tension that weighed on his chest, and approached, his voice now low but full of emotion. "Harper, maybe I made the wrong decisions. Maybe I was too harsh, but that's for my own protection and the protection of what I've built. Understand, this is the only way I know to keep things under control." Harper felt the frankness in his words, but she was determined to stick to her choice. "I understand, Alexander, and that's why I need to go. That's why I can't continue here anymore, pretending that we can get along while everything remains in control." She hesitated for a moment, her heart sinking at the sight of him so vulnerable. "I need something more than that, something that goes beyond a project or a position." Alexander remained silent, her every word penetrating the layers of control he had built. And for the first time, Harper realized that there was something in his eyes, something that he might never confess, but that she sensed. He cared about her, not just with her work, but with who she was, with what she meant to him. As she turned to leave, she felt a firm hand grab her arm, and she turned around, surprised. Alexander stared at her, his eyes intense, and for a moment the silence between them seemed to fill the room, as if all the words had been said. He released her slowly, hesitating. "Harper, don't go. Not because of any mistake of mine." There was a sincerity in his tone, an honesty she had never heard before. She took a deep breath, feeling tears starting to sting her eyes, but she tried to hold on. "Alexander, I'm not going because of a mistake. I'm going because I need to find myself, because I need to discover who I am without depending on your approval or your presence. I need a space where I don't feel this pain." The words came out with difficulty, but she knew they were the truth she had been carrying for months. Alexander seemed to want to respond, but stopped, perhaps realizing he had nothing else to say. Finally, after a long exchange of glances, he took a step back, his face taking on a resigned expression. "I don't want you to go, Harper, but if this is truly your decision, know that the door will be open if you change your mind." Harper nodded, swallowing the sadness that tightened her chest. The farewell was implicit, but she knew there was no other way. With a heavy heart, he left the office, leaving behind the pain and unrequited hope, but taking with him the certainty that he was taking control of his life. Alexander remained silent in the office, Harper's every word echoing in his mind. The door he imagined keeping open now seemed empty, as if in letting her go, he had lost a part of himself that he would never get back. Harper was in a cafe near her new office when she spotted a familiar figure at the entrance. Her expression, which had previously displayed a newfound serenity, changed to nervous surprise when she realized it was David, her ex-boyfriend. He watched her with a smile that, although restrained, carried a familiarity she hadn't felt in a long time. He approached slowly, and Harper, trying to maintain her composure, gave a slight smile in response. "Harper, how long?" exclaimed David, his voice filled with a nostalgia that Harper recognized all too well. They had shared years of coexistence, career dreams, and life projects that, in one way or another, ended up being lost in time. "I saw you're back in town, and I had to come see you. How are you?" Harper greeted him with a brief and hesitant hug, trying to hide the mix of surprise and discomfort. She had closed the chapter with David a long time ago, but she couldn't deny that the memory of him was still a part of her past that always appeared when she thought about who she was and who she could have become. "I'm fine, David. Lots of changes, actually. But what about you? Are you still living in Seattle? Not anymore, he replied, as he pulled out a chair and sat down facing her, as if no time had passed between them. Actually, I moved here again. I started my own consulting company, and apparently we're even in similar industries now. I heard about your job change, the job at Blake Innovations. David was looking at her with interest, and Harper felt the discomfort grow as she noticed that he seemed more determined than usual. It was as if he was there for more than a simple visit. The conversation with David continued, each minute bringing a feeling that he, in fact, intended to renew contact and perhaps even rescue some trace of what they lived together. Harper, I must say that not having you by my side was something that took a toll. Over time, I realized how important you were to me. Maybe, who knows, now things could be different. The question was direct, but before she could answer, she felt her cell phone vibrate in her bag. He saw that it was a message from Alexander. Since his dismissal, they had only exchanged brief emails about the transition of some projects, but the mere mention of his name made something inside her twist. Harper looked away from his cell phone screen, where Alexander had sent a brief message asking for one last meeting to discuss the final deliverables. He knew he needed to conclude these issues before moving forward with the new phase of his life, but he couldn't help but feel a pang when imagining himself face to face with Alexander, especially after all the emotional weight of his farewell. When she returned to the cafe, David was watching her, trying to interpret the expression that had appeared on her face. "Is there a problem?" he asked, trying to sound casual but not disguising his interest. Harper put away her cell phone, trying to hide her discomfort. "Nothing much, just some work commitments," she said. But David's expression didn't change. It was clear he had noticed how scattered she was, and as if wanting to capture her attention again, he leaned forward, his tone softer. "Harper, you don't need to answer right now, but maybe we should see each other more. I still feel sorry for both of us. I know you're busy, but I'd love to see you again," calmly. He looked at her intensely, and Harper realized that, even after all this time, he was still trying to recover what was left of the connection between them. Without responding, Harper forced a polite smile and said goodbye. The truth was that her heart was still tied to everything she had recently experienced with Alexander, and any attempt to rekindle the past with David seemed out of place, like a page in a book she no longer read. Still, as she left the cafe, something in her chest tightened. Perhaps it was the need to reaffirm the path she had chosen when she left Alexander's company. But she also knew that a part of her was still seeking some kind of closure. The next morning, Harper received a new message from Alexander, reiterating the meeting he needed to review some of the outstanding points of unfinished projects. She was ready to finish the processes, even though she knew that seeing him one more time could bring back all the feelings and memories she tried so hard to avoid. With a restless heart, she accepted the invitation, determined to see that meeting as a final stage. When she arrived at the Blake Innovations office, she felt the familiar weight of the environment that had meant so much to her. The receptionist greeted her with a friendly smile, and Harper headed to Alexander's office, trying to emotionally prepare herself for the conversation. He was behind the desk when she entered, his eyes down on some documents. But upon noticing her presence, he immediately stood up. Alexander looked at her, his gaze filled with a mix of emotions that Harper already knew well contained anger, hurt, and an admiration that, even if he tried to hide it, was always there. For a moment, neither spoke. The heavy silence seemed to echo each of the words they had avoided. "Thanks for coming, Harper," he began, his voice low and controlled. "I know it's a little uncomfortable, but I needed to talk to you in person about some final adjustments, and I wanted to take this opportunity to clarify that I regret the way we handled things." Harper nodded, feeling that no matter how much those words affected her, she needed to maintain her composure. "I appreciate the chance to wrap this up professionally, Alexander. It's important to me too." The answer was firm, but Alexander noticed the tension that permeated each word. As they discussed the remaining points, Harper felt his presence increasingly oppressive, the familiar scent of his perfume bringing back all the memories she had tried to bury. The exchange of glances intensified, the closeness between them almost unbearable. until Harper felt the need to break that suffocating silence. "I met David recently," she said, unexpectedly, trying to divert her own thoughts from Alexander and remembering the conversation at the cafe. The mention of his ex-boyfriend's name caused a small reaction in Alexander, a hardening of his features that Harper noticed immediately. "David? The same one who was your boyfriend?" Alexander replied, his voice taking on a cold tone, filled with barely concealed irritation. He tried to keep his tone professional, but Harper could see the jealousy evident in the way he looked at her. "Yes, he came back to the city," she replied, feeling a hint of satisfaction at his reaction, even though she knew this was dangerous territory. "We're just getting back in touch, nothing big." The phrase was said casually, but she knew Alexander would understand what it meant. The silence that followed was even more charged than before. Alexander looked away, forcing himself to focus on the papers on his desk, but Harper knew something about him had changed. He couldn't hide the coldness that now crept into his expression, an attempt to block out any vulnerability he still felt towards her. "Well, it's great that you have people who care about you," Alexander said, in a voice that Harper could tell was more distant and formal than any she had heard from him. She knew the reference was clearly directed at her ex-boyfriend, but she felt uncomfortable with the way he tried to hide the jealousy that clearly still affected him. "Alexander," she said, trying to remain calm, but not hiding the frustration in her voice. "I don't understand why you're reacting this way. We made our choices, and you chose to push me away. It doesn't make sense now to act like you have any right to feel this way." He stared at her, the coldness in his gaze intensified, but Harper knew that, behind that expression, there were feelings he didn't want to admit. "I've never had a problem accepting my decisions, Harper. I just hope you can accept yours." His response was cutting, and Harper realized that even when he tried to be distant, he couldn't help the emotions that always seemed to show through. Feeling the suffocating tension, she grabbed the remaining documents and prepared to leave, her head high but her heart aching. "Anyway, I appreciate the time I spent here," Harper said, keeping his voice steady. "It was an experience that taught me a lot." And with that, he turned away, leaving Alexander alone in the office. But as he crossed the hallway towards the exit, Harper realized that the impact of that farewell would not be easily erased. Despite everything, part of her still yearned for recognition, for a sign that he felt the same emptiness as she did. She knew she was trying to move on, but the pain of losing something that never really started gnawed at her in a way that kept her from any peace. Alexander stood still at his desk, every word spoken echoing as a reminder that Harper was, in fact, drifting away irreversibly. Even though he tried to maintain his coolness, he felt the loss like a wound that opened wider every second. News of the cyber attack on Blake Innovations reached Harper. One cold morning while she was immersed in a meeting at her new job, the phone vibrated incessantly in her bag, and it was only when she saw the number of an old teammate that she understood the gravity of the situation. Blake Innovations was under attack, and despite having already left the company, she knew there were critical parts of the system that only she and Alexander knew in depth. She hesitated for a moment, but worry and duty spoke louder than any hurt. He closed the meeting, announced his urgent absence to the new boss, and, with his heart racing, went to the company's headquarters. At the front desk, she felt a familiar tension as she explained that she was there to help with the emergency. An assistant immediately led her to the floor where Alexander and the technical team were already mobilized. As she entered the makeshift war room, the constant sound of keyboards, distressed voices, and monitors flashing with lines of code surrounded her. In the center of the room, Alexander, with a tense expression and his gaze fixed on the screens, analyzed the situation with the cybersecurity engineers. When he saw her, for a moment his eyes revealed surprise, but he quickly focused again, hiding any emotion that could betray him. "Harper," he said, in a formal tone but with an intensity that made her shudder, "we need you. The attack is focused on a hole that was developed in the monitoring system you and I set up. If we can trace the source, perhaps we can contain the damage." Harper nodded, already diving into the problem. He sat down next to Alexander and began typing frantically, trying to trace the origins of the unauthorized access and understand how the system had been compromised. Adrenaline replaced any emotional discomfort, and she realized that, even in the face of tension, there was a strange harmony between them. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she and Alexander exchanged quick instructions and updates, each understanding the other's reasoning with almost instinctive precision. For the next few hours, the room buzzed with technical discussions and strategic plans. Harper and Alexander took turns analyzing access routes and reconfiguring protections. They worked together tirelessly, facing a relentless wave of threats and responses that demanded total focus. Alexander was at her side, every action coordinated with hers, every instruction given with the precision she had always admired in him. At one point, Harper stopped when he saw a vulnerable point that they could use to deflect part of the attack. "Alexander, if we redirect this flow to the secondary server, we will gain time to reinforce the main barriers," she suggested, pointing to one of the compromised access points. Alexander nodded, his gaze fixed on her for a second longer than necessary. "Brilliant, Harper. You always have a strategic vision," he said, with a lightness that seemed strangely intimate, considering the chaos around him. Those words brought back the admiration and respect that they had shared for so long, and that, for a moment, seemed to have been restored. With the plan in motion, they remained on the front line of defense, exchanging instructions and confirming each step with a synchronicity that Harper felt like a deeper connection. However, at one of the most critical moments, when a new attack swept through the system, Harper's eyes met Alexander's, and she noticed something different in his gaze, an intense concern, as if the critical situation and the hours of work together had brought out deeper feelings. As the dawn wore on and the team began to tire, Harper and Alexander stood their ground, checking and adjusting every vulnerable spot they located. At some point, Alexander paused and looked directly at her, exhaustion and something else written across his face. "Harper, I don't know how we would be handling this without you. I was stubborn and arrogant in letting you go." The sentence was said in a low voice, but she heard the genuine regret in his words. Harper was unable to respond immediately. She knew that moment required concentration, but his confession echoed in her mind, stirring every feeling she had been trying to bury. "I did what I thought was necessary, Alexander," she finally replied, her voice shaking but trying to focus on the lines of code in front of her. "Maybe we both made difficult choices." Silence stretched between them, and for an instant, the attack and the surrounding chaos disappeared. Alexander approached, and she felt his hand briefly touch hers. The touch was light but affectionate, filled with a sincerity and closeness that Harper had never imagined reliving. "Harper, even now, I see how much you mean to all of this, to me." She looked at him, and the emotional barriers she had insisted on building began to crumble. "Alexander, I wanted to stay too, but the pain was unbearable," he murmured, his voice low. "I no longer knew how to deal with what I felt, with what we were both avoiding." He nodded, his expression revealing the pent-up pain of all those months away. "I knew I was hurting you, but I couldn't help it. I was trying to protect myself, and in doing so, I only pushed away the person who meant the most to me." Alexander sighed, looking at her as if he finally understood the depth of his feelings. His voice was filled with a sincerity she had rarely heard. "I never wanted to push you away, Harper, but things between us are more complicated than I was prepared to face." There was an implicit confession, something she had always known, but that he had never expressed. The two remained silent, feeling the intensity of what they had confessed, while the noises around them brought them back to the reality of the situation. They returned to the task of defending the system, but now there was a new energy between them, a silent closeness that replaced distance and pride. The exchange of glances became more and more constant, each word spoken, filled with an affection and respect that Harper knew was beyond a simple professional partnership. As morning dawned and the attack lost strength, exhaustion took over the team. But the feeling of victory also spread throughout the room. Harper and Alexander knew that together they had managed to protect the system and save the integrity of the company. But there was something more, something that remained between them like an unresolved tension, a connection that now seemed impossible to ignore. When the team finally dispersed, Harper and Alexander remained in the room, sitting side by side in comfortable silence, exhausted but aware that this was an important moment. Without saying anything, Alexander held her hand, his fingers intertwined with hers, with a firmness that demonstrated everything he had tried to hide. "Harper," he said, his voice husky and sincere, "I know apologizing now seems too late, but I need you to know how sorry I am. You were never just an employee to me, and you never will be." The sincerity in his voice was overwhelming, and Harper felt a wave of emotions wash over her. "I never stopped caring either, Alexander. Even far away, I always thought of you. But I've been through a lot, and I know that maybe it's too late for us." Harper tried to be honest with herself, with the feelings that hurt her, but also with the desire to believe that maybe there was a chance for them. Alexander leaned forward, eyes steady on hers. "It's not too late, Harper. Not for how I feel. I know I was arrogant and cruel in pushing you away, and I've spent every day since then missing you." He hesitated for a moment, but the intense gaze remained. "I know I may have lost your trust, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get it back." Harper looked at him, feeling the depth of his words cut through every layer of hurt she had built up. For a moment, she forgot all the reasons that led her to walk away and realized that, no matter how much she tried to escape, a part of her still wanted that chance, still yearned to see where it could take them. Without another word, Alexander pulled her to him, and their lips met in a deep, slow kiss, filled with everything they had repressed. The room, the monitor lights, and the remnants of adrenaline seemed to disappear, leaving them involved only in the moment that they both knew needed to be lived. His hands held her face with careful intensity, and Harper returned the kiss with a dedication she never imagined she would have for him. When the kiss ended, Alexander looked at her with a light smile, still serious, but full of affection that he could no longer disguise. "Harper, if there's still a chance for us to start over, I'm willing to fight for it. This time, without letting fear stop me." She nodded, her eyes shining with a hope that was now beginning to be reborn. "Me too, Alexander, but we need to rebuild this little by little, with everything we didn't say before." It was a silent promise that they were both willing to face whatever came, one step at a time. Still with their hands intertwined, they left the room together, ready to face not only the challenges of the work, but also the path they would need to take to restore the trust and affection that finally allowed them to flourish. The night was silent in the office. The usual sounds of keyboards and hurried conversations had disappeared, leaving only the low hum of fluorescent lights and the soft sound of your footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. After an exhausting day and victory over the cyber attack, Harper and Alexander remained there, sitting side by side in a small conference room, while the other employees had dispersed hours ago. The weight of the adrenaline of work still hung over them, but it was softened by the unexpected peace of that night, by the simple presence of each other. Alexander watched Harper in silence, feeling a wave of emotions he could no longer contain. He had fought so hard against how he felt, trying to maintain his professionalism and his tough stance. But all of that had fallen apart over the last few months. After everything they had experienced together, the fights, the attempts to keep their distance, and even the pride that had driven them apart, he could no longer deny how much she meant. It was more than admiration, more than attraction. It was something that grew within him so intensely and inevitably that it seemed now the only truth left. "Harper," he murmured finally, his voice low but charged with an emotion that made her turn to him, her eyes taking in every detail of Alexander's face. "I need to tell you something that I've tried to avoid for too long." She kept her gaze fixed on his, feeling her own heart speed up, but trying to remain calm. There was an intensity in Alexander's voice that she had rarely heard, a tone that seemed to strip away every layer of control he had insisted on maintaining. "Say it," she replied, also in a low voice, as if any louder word could break that fragile moment between them. Alexander approached slowly, his expression soft, but his eyes revealing the weight of what he wanted to confess. "I can no longer pretend that this is just a matter of work or respect. Harper, you are the person who makes me feel things I never imagined I would feel again. I was so used to having everything under control, so trapped to this idea of perfection and detachment, but then you appeared. And since then, Everything has changed." His words left her stunned. She had always imagined he felt something, but hearing Alexander say it in such a vulnerable and open way was like a dream she never thought possible. "Alexander," she replied, her voice breaking, I also tried to resist, but the truth is that, from the first moment, I felt something different between us. Even with the fights, the distance, and everything that happened, I could never get away from you." The tension between them seemed to vibrate in the air, becoming palpable, almost inevitable. Alexander reached out and, with a gentle touch, cupped her face, his fingers sliding over her skin with the delicacy of someone who had longed for that touch. "I don't want to fight this anymore, Harper. And honestly, I don't think I could even if I tried." Her answer came silently, and Harper closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his hand on her face and the soft touch of his lips, moving closer until finally they met. The kiss was calm, but carried with a depth that they had both held for so long. Alexander held her with a careful firmness, as if promising he would never let her go again, while Harper held her back, letting every barrier and fear dissolve. The night progressed as they gave themselves to each other, forgetting the world around them. That cold and empty room, lit only by the dim light that came through the windows, became a refuge for both of them. Alexander pulled her closer, the kiss intensifying as Harper let every part of her surrender to the moment. The months of distance and repressed feelings seemed to dissolve, and for the first time, they both allowed themselves to be totally honest, vulnerable like they had never been before. After a while, Alexander led her to his apartment, the space lit only by the dim light of dawn. He held her as if she were something rare and precious, and when they closed the door, they both knew that that night would change everything. Alexander caressed her face with a care that Harper had never imagined, his fingers gliding over her skin as he looked into her eyes. Unhurriedly, as if he were trying to memorize every detail. "Harper," he whispered, in an almost reverent tone, "I don't know how I was able to live so long denying how I feel about you." His voice was deep but soft, and the words became silent promises. Harper smiled, excited, and responded without needing words, involving him in a deep kiss. When they finally gave themselves completely, every touch and every caress carried the weight of all the moments they had lost, and all the promises that were now implicit between them. Alexander surrounded her with an intensity and tenderness that made her forget any hurt or insecurity, and Harper allowed herself to be herself without reservations, without the pride or barriers that had previously prevented her from experiencing that feeling. The dawn advanced, and with the dawn, both knew that reality awaited them. Alexander, although he tried to enjoy every moment with her, was aware of the difficulties they would face when bringing that into the real world. "Harper," he murmured as he stroked her hair, his eyes fixed on her, "I don't want to hide it, but I know that for now we need to be discreet. The company, the environment. I can't put you or your work at risk." Harper understood his caution. The intensity and involvement between them was evident, but the corporate reality that surrounded them made everything more complicated. She nodded, holding his hand. "I know. I understand the risks. And honestly, Alexander, what matters is that we're here now. We can keep this between us, at least for now." He smiled, relieved, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I just want you to know that for me, this is real. It's not just one night or a decision made on the spur of the moment." Alexander kissed her again, his lips conveying everything he couldn't express in words. The following weeks were a careful dance of secrets and furtive encounters. At work, they maintained a professional posture, communicating only as necessary and exchanging glances that only they understood. The connection between them deepened with each stolen moment, and the smiles and discreet touches they exchanged were enough to reaffirm how they felt without the need for explanations. However, even with the furtive encounters, Harper knew that the secret relationship had its limitations. She longed for normal moments with him, like any other couple, but she understood that, for now, it was the necessary sacrifice. Alexander, on the other hand, was torn between the desire to protect her and the desire to share his happiness with the world. When they were together, he treated her with affection that she had never imagined someone like him could express. But when they were apart, they both felt the weight of hiding what was so important. Over time, The secret began to make them more attentive, more careful. Every gesture, every look, and every word exchanged were loaded with meanings that only they understood. The hidden relationship united them in an almost conspiratorial complicity. And even knowing the risks, Harper and Alexander committed themselves to it with intensity and confidence. One night, while they were together in his apartment, Harper watched Alexander in silence, his face illuminated by the dim kitchen light as he prepared something for them. He felt his heart accelerate, recognizing that, no matter how complicated the situation was, he had never felt something so true and profound. She approached him and wrapped him in a hug, feeling the warmth of his body, the feeling of belonging that she had longed for. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice low and sincere, "I don't know where this will lead, but I'm willing to find out." He looked at her, his eyes shining with silent happiness, and kissed her with the same intensity as always, as if that moment were eternal. "Then let's find out together," he replied, caressing her face with a tenderness that made her feel safe and loved. "No matter what happens, Harper, as long as we're together, I know we can face anything." At that moment, they both knew that no matter what challenges they encountered, they were willing to fight to keep what they had. And so, between complicit glances and secret meetings, they built something true, something that, even hidden, shone more intensely than anything else in their lives. The revelation of the relationship between Alexander and Harper happened like a bolt of lightning from a clear, violent, and unexpected sky. Harper had received an email from an anonymous source, and when she opened it, her blood ran cold as she read the threat written in a few cold, objective words. "We know about your relationship with Alexander Blake. Unless you want to see it in every headlines and watch Blake Innovations collapse, I suggest you make a careful decision." She read the email over and over, her chest tight with fear and disbelief. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and knew that, with a single message, the entire future that she and Alexander were trying to build with such careful steps was threatened. He knew that Blake Innovations was on the radar of several competitors, each one waiting for the slightest opportunity to attack. But he had no idea that his personal life could be a piece on the cruel board of that game. That night, when she met Alexander, she felt her heart break as she tried to decide how to tell him. He looked exhausted, but when he saw her, a smile appeared, filled with a sweetness and calm that Harper knew wouldn't last much longer. Before she could muster the courage to speak, he noticed the tension on her face. "Harper, what happened?" he asked, his tone soft but concerned. "You look pale. Something at work? Any emergencies?" She took a deep breath, trying to find a way to tell him, but she realized that the only way to deal with it was to face him with the whole truth. He sat on the sofa next to him, holding Alexander's hand, and looked into his eyes with the obvious pain he was trying to contain. "Alexander, today I received an anonymous message. They know about us, and they're threatening to make it public if we don't do something." Alexander's expression changed within seconds. Surprise gave way to anger and intense focus. "Do they know? Who are they? And what are they asking for?" His voice was tense but still in control, as if he was trying to rationalize the situation before deciding his next move. "I don't know exactly who sent it," she replied, her voice weak, "but whoever it is has made it clear that they won't stop until—" "Alexander, this could destroy your reputation and everything you've built at the company." The confession came out in a whisper, and he squeezed her hand firmly, his eyes fixed on hers, as if to convey strength and calm. "Harper, let's figure this out together. This isn't the first time they've tried to take me down, and it won't be the last." Alexander tried to sound confident, but she saw the concern in his eyes. He knew that this time the attack was different, that the blow came not from a technical or commercial vulnerability, but from a personal exposure that they had both tried to avoid at all costs. Harper, for his part, felt a growing pain as he spoke. She knew that no matter how much she tried to minimize the impact, Alexander was at risk, and it was all because of her. If he had already sacrificed so much to keep the relationship a secret, how could he ask him to risk his career and his company for a love that, although true, threatened to destroy everything he had built? "Alexander," she murmured, interrupting his flow of words, "I can't allow your life to be destroyed because of me. I should have been more careful. I should have realized that this could happen." He shook his head, frustration showing. "Harper, you didn't do anything wrong. We both made that choice. What's happening is a consequence of a decision we made together. And that's why we're going to face this together." He tried to convince himself as much as her, but the fear that the threats might come true seemed latent. She watched him in silence, feeling a growing sadness. Harper knew that if she truly cared about Alexander, she should protect him, even if it meant walking away. Even though the prospect of leaving him destroyed her inside, perhaps it was the only way to prevent their relationship from ruining everything he had worked to build. Harper took a deep breath, a decision taking shape in her mind, and with a heavy heart, she looked at him. "I need to leave, Alexander. I need to leave the company. Leave all of this behind. That's the only way to protect you." Alexander stared at her, eyes wide with disbelief. "No, I won't let you do that. Harper, leaving won't solve the problem. This person already knows about us, and leaving the company will only show that they bullied us." She looked down, feeling the pain of impending separation squeezing every part of her. "Alexander, I can't be the cause of your undoing. Maybe I should have been more careful before accepting how I felt about you. But now I can't ignore what's at stake." Alexander came closer, holding her face firmly and tenderly, his eyes shining with a desperation he rarely showed. "Harper, I love you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is more important than any threat, any risk. We will find a way to protect the company, to resolve this. But we cannot give up on each other." His words carried the intensity of a promise, and for a moment, Harper wanted to believe that it was enough to ward off all threats. But she knew, with painful clarity, that their love, however true and deep, would not erase the threats that hung over them both. Even though she wanted to fight for him, she understood that the greatest act of love she could offer was to let Alexander move on without her, without the weight of a relationship that had now become a target in the hands of his enemies. With silent tears streaming down her face, Harper gently pushed his hands away, taking a step back. "I love you too, Alexander, but that's exactly why I can't stay by your side. I need to protect you, even if it destroys me." The pain in her words reverberated through the room, each syllable filled with the anguish and longing that was already beginning to take over. He tried to get closer, but she shook her head, moving away with the firmness of someone who needed to make an inevitable decision. "Please understand," he murmured, his voice fragile. "I need to go." With one last exchange of glances, she turned and walked towards the door, her heart in pieces. As she heard Alexander's footsteps stop, resigned, on the other side of the room. In the days that followed, Harper made preparations to leave the company discreetly, leaving no trace that could fuel further rumors. She asked for a permanent leave of absence, finishing documents and projects in silence, trying to suffocate the pain that consumed her with each step taken towards the end. Every corner, every room, and every familiar sound in the company brought back memories of Alexander, making the farewell even more devastating. Outside, Alexander did his best to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but the closest employees noticed the change in his expression, the look of anguish that, no matter how much he tried to hide it, seemed to overflow in every gesture. Missing Harper was an open wound, and while he took steps to protect the company and try to identify the source of the threat, he knew that none of it would be enough to fill the void she left. Even in the early hours of solitary work, when he tried to concentrate on the countless corporate decisions that previously occupied him, Alexander found himself unable to shake the image of Harper. Every line of code, every project they reviewed, every coffee they drank in the empty office was a painful reminder of what they had shared. The weight of her absence, of the love they sacrificed, became unbearable. Over time, Alexander realized that no matter how hard he tried to protect the company and its legacy, nothing would stop him from fighting for what really mattered. He knew it was necessary to face those who threatened them, but he also understood that Harper was part of it all, and that his presence was essential for both the company and him. Harper, in her new job and trying to rebuild a life without him, felt equally empty. Every day was a reminder that she had left behind what she loved most, and even though she fought to move on, she knew she could never erase her love for Alexander. On the morning of the farewell, Harper arrived early at the Blake Innovations building, where the hallways were still quiet and empty. He knew he needed a moment alone before the hectic pace of the office occupied every corner. This would be the last time he would cross those halls as part of that team, and the thought was painful, but also a kind of relief. He knew that this farewell was a chance to regain control of his life, to rebuild himself without the shadow of love that, although it had been the truest he had experienced, had become unsustainable. He walked through each room, greeted the few colleagues he encountered, and with a racing heart, headed to Alexander's office. The door was ajar, and he was sitting at the table, his expression austere and his eyes downcast, fixed somewhere on the papers, as if he were lost in thought. Hearing Harper's presence, Alexander looked up, and the sadness he was trying to hide showed in a devastating way. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Dense silence filled the environment, filled with everything they had experienced, the nights of work, the fights, the smiles and the feelings they shared, even though they now needed to hide it. She felt the urge to speak, but words seemed insufficient to express everything that was there. He felt strangely distant, as if part of him was still trying to protect itself from the pain of a definitive goodbye. "So is it today?" Alexander finally murmured, his voice low, as if he still wanted this to be a nightmare that he could wake up from at any moment. His serious and restrained tone tried to hide his anguish, but his eyes, intense and dark, made it clear that, no matter how much he tried to hide it, he was suffering. "Yes," she replied, her voice shaky but firm. Harper kept her gaze fixed on his, without looking away, wanting him to know how much that decision was destroying her. "It's what's best for all of us, Alexander. For the company, and for you." She tried to remain calm, but her throat felt tight, and each word came out with a pain that she could no longer hide. He took a deep breath, fighting to maintain his composure. "You know, this isn't the way out I wanted, Harper. I tried to convince you to stay. I tried every way, but I realize nothing I say will change your decision." His voice was resigned, but she realized how much it cost him. He closed his eyes for a second, as if trying to find strength, and when he spoke again, his expression was filled with sincerity. "Harper, I know that at some point I failed you, but I never wanted it to end like this. I never wanted to lose you like this." The pain showed in every word, and she felt her heart tighten even more. Part of her wanted to give in, forget the threats and everything that was at stake and stay there with him. But reason told her that leaving was the only way to preserve their integrity. "I didn't want it to be like that either," she replied, her voice breaking. "But I need to move on, Alexander. I need to know that I'm capable of something beyond what we've had here. I need to prove to myself that I can be independent, that I can build something for myself." Harper wasn't just saying it to him, but to herself, as if she wanted to engrave those words on her heart, strengthening the decision she had made with so much sacrifice. Alexander stood up, his eyes still fixed on her, as if their proximity was a last attempt to burn her into his memory. He walked to where she was and in a careful gesture held her hands, his fingers firm but trembling. "Harper, I will never forget you. Every moment, every conversation, every look of yours is with me. But I want you to know that if you ever change your mind, if you ever feel like you need me, I'll be here." Those words broke what was left of her defenses. Harper felt the tears fall silently and held his hands tightly, as if she didn't want to let go. As if, for one last moment, she could keep that touch forever. "Thank you, Alexander. You were the best and worst thing that happened in my life, and I will never forget you either." The words came out broken by tears, but she knew he would understand what they meant. They both stood there, their hands intertwined, their eyes filled with a sadness and tenderness that said more than words could express. It was a silent farewell, a goodbye full of meanings, of everything they had experienced and of all the promises they could not keep. They felt broken, but they also knew that this was the end they needed to accept. Harper let go of his hands, took a deep breath and took a step back, her heart still racing and her eyes teary but determined. "Take care of yourself, Alexander," she said, with one last parting look before turning and leaving. As I crossed the door and walked down the hallway towards the elevator, I felt the weight of pain in each step, but also a sense of relief, as if the decision, although cruel, was the release they both needed. That night, after leaving the Blake Innovations building, Harper made an important decision. If she wanted to move forward and prove to herself that she was capable of building something solid, she couldn't just take another job and hide in the shadow of a new company. He needed to do something of his own, something that represented his independence and talent. He had spent too much time following orders, adapting to the projects and ideals of others. Now was the time to discover your own ability. Determined to reinvent herself, Harper began planning to open her own startup. He gathered his ideas, drew up the first sketches, and started working on a project that combined his passions and skills. The idea was to create an innovative platform aimed at small businesses that could offer technological analysis and management tools for emerging companies. She knew there was an underserved market for this and felt she could help entrepreneurs grow, make their businesses stronger and prosper, something she herself wanted to achieve. The weeks that followed were filled with intense work. Harper threw his heart and soul into the project, taking advantage of every contact, every resource he could access, and every small advance. The emptiness she felt after leaving Alexander was a constant presence, but she learned to transform it into fuel, into a force that drove her to move forward. The longing was still painful, but little by little it became a kind of silent memory that brought him inspiration. Over time, things began to come together, and Harper felt like he was finally creating something that was truly his own. She saw herself responsible for every detail, from conception to execution, and each achievement, no matter how small, was proof that her decision to leave had been right. The first closed contracts, satisfied clients, and the team she was starting to train were signs that she was on the right path. During this period, Harper stayed away from any news from Blake Innovations, refusing to look back, even though she still thought about Alexander frequently. She knew that he was dealing with her absence in his own way, and even imagining how he had reacted to seeing her leave and not coming back, she preferred not to harbor the desire to meet him again. Now her life needed to take a different path, and she was determined to make it meaningful. However, one night, while reviewing a client's data and making notes about the upcoming project, he received an unexpected message. It was an invitation to a local corporate event aimed at new startups, where several renowned companies would participate to learn about new ventures. She hesitated to accept, knowing that Alexander would inevitably also be present at the event. Even so, Harper knew this was an important opportunity to promote her company, to prove that she was achieving something that represented her. When she arrived at the event, Harper was determined to focus on her professional purpose and avoid any emotional distractions. Impeccably dressed, with renewed confidence and her presentation materials ready, she greeted potential investors, exchanged contacts, and presented her platform with a clarity that reflected the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. It was in the middle of a conversation with a businessman that she felt a pair of familiar eyes watching her. Alexander was there, a few feet away, and the expression on his face was a mix of surprise, pride, and something else, something Harper couldn't completely decipher. He seemed tense, but there was also a gleam of admiration in his eyes when he saw her there, as if he knew that the project she was fighting for was the result of every lesson, every experience they had shared. They approached silently, his gaze still fixed on her, and Harper felt a rush of emotions as his words approached. "Harper," he said, his voice soft and proud, "I see you're building something amazing. Congratulations," she smiled, feeling her heart beat faster when she heard the sincere tone of his voice. "Thank you, Alexander. It was something I needed to do for myself." The answer was simple, but loaded with meaning, and they both knew that, despite the distance, there was still a deep connection between them. As the night progressed, the two remained together at the event, exchanging stories and remembering moments. There was a new harmony, a renewed peace between them, and Harper felt that, somehow, this parting finally made sense. Success came to Harper like a slow, steady wave, built with each decision, each effort, and each night of intense work. His startup, which had started almost as a refuge after leaving Blake Innovations, had now established itself as a promising company, attracting investors and attracting the attention of large clients. Harper dove headfirst into her work, dedicating herself to building something she could call her own, a space where her intelligence and vision found freedom and purpose. Watching his company grow, Harper felt a mix of pride and accomplishment. Now, she was the one making all the decisions, leading a small but talented team, and watching the evolution of an idea that had emerged almost as an escape, but had turned into a genuine passion. She had become a respected figure in the technology scene, participating in panel discussions and events where large companies closely watched her every move. To everyone around her, she was an inspiration, a determined entrepreneur who had left behind a solid career at one of the most renowned companies to build something of her own. But while each day was filled with tasks, deadlines, and negotiations, Harper carried an emptiness that accompanied each achievement. It was as if, deep down, a part of him was always incomplete. Alexander was a silent presence, a constant reminder of something she missed. As much as she tried to focus on the present and the future, she felt torn between the joy of success and the weight of a longing that she never confessed. Sometimes, in the silence of the office when everyone had gone, she would find herself reviewing the way it had all ended. She couldn't forget Alexander's look in their last conversation, the way he held her hands, or the words of love they both said before saying goodbye. He had been by her side since the beginning of her career. He was the one who encouraged and challenged her, and, despite the circumstances that separated them, Harper knew that the emptiness she felt was, in fact, the longing for that unfinished love. Alexander, on the other hand, seemed to be pursuing his own internal battle. Since Harper had left the company, he had immersed himself in his work even more, compensating for her absence with an almost obsessive dedication. He knew that the end of the relationship was a choice that he had forced himself. Fear of repercussions and pride had blinded him, leading him to believe that pushing her away was the best decision. But over time, he began to realize how much that choice was eating at him. He was more alone, more distant from everyone around him, and the emptiness that Harper's absence had left seemed to grow like a shadow that he couldn't dispel. Little by little, Alexander began to follow the progress of Harper's company, even from a distance. I couldn't help but feel proud to see her prosper. I watched the news about her achievements, new contracts, and the growth of her startup with silent admiration. She was doing what she said, proving that she was capable of building something of her own, of being independent and successful. He knew this was the result not only of his intelligence, but of a courage he himself had rarely had. At some point, Alexander realized that his pride was not only an impediment to the love they both felt, but also what kept him trapped in an empty life and superficial relationships. Over time, this perception began to turn into an unsustainable weight. He knew he had walked away from Harper to protect the company, to maintain his image and avoid risks. But now he understood that none of that mattered without her. Alexander realized that Harper was not only the woman he loved, but the person who inspired him to be better, to challenge himself, and to grow. She was the balance he had never found in anyone else. He knew that pushing her away was a mistake, but his own guilt and pride prevented him from going to her. One lonely night, Alexander decided it was time to face what he had been avoiding. Sitting in his empty office, with the city shining beneath the view from the windows, he finally allowed every memory, every mistake, and every decision that pushed them apart to surface. It was time to admit that Harper was an essential part of his life, and that he was incapable of moving forward without her. He had spent months avoiding it, convincing himself that everything was fine. But the truth was inescapable. His pride and his choices had left him with a meaningless life. Determined to do something about it, he began to compose a message for Harper, something that made clear everything he felt and that admitted, in full letters, the mistake he had made. Meanwhile, Harper continued his routine, focused on expanding his company and building new projects. However, that night, while working on an investor presentation, he felt an urge to look at his cell phone. The screen displayed a message from Alexander, a surprise that left her stunned and her heart racing. She hesitated for a moment, but the urge to know what he had to say was stronger. When she opened the message, She found words that seemed to echo everything she had ever wanted to hear. Harper, I know this message comes too late. I spent months thinking pushing you away was the right decision, but I realized I was trying to protect my pride, not the company. You are the only person who has ever made me feel something true. Nothing has I need to see you. I need to tell you what I really feel, without the fears and barriers I created. If you're willing, meet me in the park where we used to walk. Harper felt her heart sink as she read each word. The emotions she had tried so hard to push away now came with an intensity that surprised her. For months, she had believed the end was definitive, but that message brought new hope. At the same time, the idea of finding him and reliving everything they had left behind was terrifying. Still, a part of her knew that she needed to listen to Alexander, that maybe this was the closure they both needed, or perhaps a new beginning. The next evening, Harper arrived at the park, the city lights twinkling in the background as the cool night air enveloped her. She walked towards the bench where they had met so many times, feeling a mixture of anxiety and expectation. When she saw Alexander standing in the shade of the trees, her heart sank, and all the memories she had tried to bury came flooding back. He looked more serious, but also more vulnerable, like he was finally ready to be completely honest with her. Harper, he said upon seeing her, his face lighting up with a restrained but sincere smile. Thank you for coming. I know I might not have the right to ask this, but I needed you to know how I'm feeling. He took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on hers, as if he was gathering the courage to say what he had been holding back for so long. She nodded, her gaze firm, but her heart agitated. I'm here, Alexander. Say what you have to say. He took a step forward, his voice thick with sincerity. I was a coward, Harper. Pushing you away was the worst decision I ever made. I thought I was protecting the company, but I was just protecting my pride. Since you've been gone, I've realized how much I need you, not just at work, but in my life. He hesitated, pain written in every line of his face. I'm nobody without you, and I just hope that one day you can forgive me. His words hit her hard. Harper felt a mixture of anger and compassion, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. He stood before her, admitting the mistake that they both knew had been fatal to their relationship. But she also knew that it wouldn't be easy to simply forgive him. Alexander, you have no idea how much you hurt me. I spent months trying to understand what I did wrong, and now you come out, saying all this. He lowered his head, eyes full of regret. I know, Harper. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but if there's a chance, even a slight chance that we can start over, I'm willing to fight. I'm willing to put all pride aside and do whatever it takes to prove to you that I don't want to live without you anymore. Harper watched him, and the sincerity in his eyes awakened something she had tried to forget. The pain, the longing, the unfinished love, everything was there. And in that moment, she knew that, despite everything, the love she felt for him was still strong. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his heart that was beating wildly, and gave a small smile. Alexander, maybe we can try, but I need time. I need to know that this is real, that you are here to stay. No games, no fear. He smiled, relieved, holding her hand carefully, as if holding something precious. I'm going to prove it to you, Harper. I'm going to show you that I'm not going anywhere. Thank you for giving me this chance. They stood in silence, side by side, as the city lights twinkled in the background. They knew that the path would be difficult, that they would need to rebuild trust and overcome all the obstacles they had created. But for the first time in months, they both felt like they were ready to face it all together. The technology industry event was at its peak when Harper entered the hall, surrounded by the vibrant and elegant atmosphere. The most renowned companies had booths organized with state-of-the-art displays, while entrepreneurs and investors exchanged ideas and cards, envisioning potential collaborations. That environment, a mix of formality and innovation, represented the new world in which she now stood out. Harper had worked hard to get there. His startup was now one of the most talked about in the sector, with technological solutions that surprised with their boldness and functionality. She walked around with confidence, greeting familiar faces and keeping scheduled appointments. But even amidst the excitement of the event, he felt a weight deep in his heart. I knew Alexander would be there. After all, Blake Innovations was one of the main sponsors, and although she had promised herself that she would stay focused on her presentation, his presence permeated her thoughts. Their last meeting in the park still resonated in her mind, and his words, so sincere, so full of regret, had touched her deeply. At one point, while talking to a potential client about his new analysis tool, he felt movement next to him. As he turned around, his eyes met Alexander's. He was standing a few meters away, his expression serene, but his eyes betraying an intensity that she knew well. He was watching her with that same penetrating gaze, and Harper knew, instantly, that he had come with the intention of completing what they had left hanging. "Harper," he murmured as he approached, his tone low and grave, as if each word carried the weight of the months of silence between them. "Can we talk? I promise not to take up too much of your time. I just need to clarify a few things." She hesitated, remembering the emotional damage his departure had caused her. The way he, even without meaning to, had taken away her confidence in herself. But part of her heart also knew that this moment was necessary, that perhaps it was the closure they both needed. Harper nodded, her gaze steady, but with a hint of curiosity and expectation that she couldn't hide. They walked together to a quieter area of the room, where the voices and hustle and bustle of the event dissipated into a kind of bubble of silence. He took a deep breath before speaking, as if trying to gather the right words, but ended up letting his gaze make the first contact. "Since you left Blake Innovations, I've noticed something important," he began, his eyes intense on hers. "Everything I've achieved, all the successes I've had, it all lost meaning without you by my side." Harper felt her heart racing, but she held her ground, determined not to give in so easily. "Alexander, you made your choice. You chose your image, the company, everything that seemed more important than us. I understand that Blake Innovations means a lot to you, but I don't think it's fair that now you just go back with regrets." He listened to her seriously, accepting the hurt in her words without trying to interrupt. He knew she was right, that he had made cruel choices. "I deserve every word, Harper, and that's exactly what I realized after you left. The company, it's my life, yes, but you were the reason I wanted to build all of this. I wanted to protect what we had built, but I realized too late that I was also protecting my pride, not our love." Alexander's words resonated deeply with Harper. Despite the time she spent trying to move on, she knew he still had a special place in her heart. And in that moment, every layer of protection she had built began to weaken, to the point where she felt completely vulnerable. "I have rebuilt myself, Alexander," she said, her voice shaky but sincere. "I found a strength in myself that I didn't know existed, and what I fear most now is going back to something that will make me lose that." He watched her, feeling the intensity and depth of the new Harper, the strong, independent woman she had become. "I know that, and the last thing I want is to make you feel trapped or dependent on me. I just want you to know that I never forgot you, that every moment without you was a learning experience, and that all I want most is be by your side, respecting the person you are today." Harper watched him, and for a moment, she felt her memories and affection for him rising to the surface, like a tide that, no matter how hard she tried to stem it, was uncontrollable. She remembered all the nights they had worked together, the heated arguments and moments of silent intimacy they had shared. He had been an essential part of her journey, and despite all the suffering, she knew she loved him, even if she tried to deny it. "Alexander," she began, her voice soft and almost broken, "I've never forgotten you either, but I need time. I need proof that I won't lose who I am just to be with you. My love for you is real, but my fear too." He nodded, holding her hand gently. "I'm here, and I'm willing to wait. I just want you to know that my love for you is unconditional, and that I'm willing to go through whatever it takes to deserve yours." His words touched her deeply, and in that instant, Harper realized that even though he had made mistakes, Alexander was trying. He was there, ready to fight for her and for what they both meant to each other. She smiled, a smile that was hesitant but full of hope, and he responded, his eyes lit up with contained happiness. When the event ended, Harper and Alexander left the room together, but not as the loving couple they once were. Now they were two reconstructed individuals, aware of the scars they carried and the challenges that lay ahead. They walked side by side, taking their time, exchanging few words, but feeling the strength of a new promise between them, something that didn't need to be said. The days that followed were slow, but filled with new hope. Alexander texted her frequently, remained present but didn't pressure her, and Harper appreciated the care and patience he showed. Each meeting was like a new chapter in a story they wrote together, with respect and space for both of them to be honest and truthful about what they wanted. A month later, on a silent night in her apartment, Harper reflected on everything they had experienced and the strength she had gained from making her own decisions. And she realized that even though she had become the independent woman she wanted, her heart still found peace in thinking about Alexander. He was, despite everything, the person who understood her best. Determined to face her feelings, Harper picked up the phone and, with her heart racing, called him. When Alexander answered, his voice hoarse with tiredness but full of joy, she felt her chest warm. "Alexander," she began, her voice low and shy but sincere, "I think I'm ready to try. But I want it to be something new, something that allows us to grow together without having to give up who we've become." He took a deep breath, and Harper heard the emotion in his voice. "I would do anything to have you by my side, Harper, and I promise that this time there will be no fear or pride that will stop us." That night, the two met again from a new perspective, aware of everything they had faced and how much they had changed. It was a fresh start, but not just where they had left off. It was the beginning of a new stage, built on trust and respect, where everyone had the necessary space to be who they were. And so, as the months passed, Harper and Alexander built a life together, this time with the security and mutual support they had long sought. She continued leading her company, he continued at Blake Innovations, and they both found a way to balance love and career, knowing that nothing could separate them again. Both had finally chosen love, but a love that respected each other's space, dreams, and achievements. It was a reconciliation that went beyond what they had dreamed of. It was a true partnership where neither of them needed to sacrifice who they were to be together. In the months that followed, Harper and Alexander maintained a careful balance between their personal lives and the professional ambitions they had achieved. Each day was new proof that they were ready for this new beginning, that their love, now strengthened by their independence, was more mature and resilient. Both maintained their companies, and Harper prospered with his startup, winning important contracts and expanding his presence in the market. As happy as they were in their renewed routine and relationship, there was something that bothered them, especially Alexander. He knew Harper had a unique talent, a keen vision that perfectly complemented his own. Sometimes, in the midst of conversations about technology and innovation, he would catch her outlining ideas that fascinated him, sketching out solutions that he would never have thought of. He noticed how the two naturally complemented each other, and this perception sparked an idea that he had been maturing in silence. One quiet night, while they were in Alexander's apartment, he decided it was time to share his thoughts with her. Sitting on the sofa with a glass of wine each, he looked at her with a serious but affectionate expression and held her hand, trying to contain the nervousness he felt. "Harper," he began, his voice quieter than usual, "I've been thinking a lot about the two of us and the way we've supported each other, both personally and professionally. And I want to make you a proposition." She watched him, curiosity sparking in her eyes. "I'm listening," she said, with a slight but attentive smile. Alexander took a deep breath, trying to organize his ideas. "I know how much your company means to you, and I know how hard you work to get where you are. But since we started over, I've realized there's a synergy between us that would be amazing in business too. What do you think about creating something together?" Harper was surprised, although she felt a warm emotion well up in her chest. Working with Alexander again had always been a thought he tried to push away, but now, with everything they had overcome, the idea seemed more appealing than he had ever imagined. "Are you asking me to be your partner, Alexander?" He smiled, his eyes shining with excitement. "I'm asking us to be partners, Harper, but this time I want us to be equal in everything. No hierarchies or power plays, just the two of us, bringing the best of us together. I feel like we could create something neither of us could, Alone, the proposal moved Harper deeply, and she remained silent, processing the weight of those words. She had always believed that her independence was essential to keeping their relationship balanced. But the truth was that working with Alexander had always brought out the best in her. He challenged her, made her limits tested, and made her discover potential she didn't even know she had. And the idea of being together again, in an environment of true partnership, without barriers of pride, made her feel something she hadn't even imagined, a renewed hope. "Alexander, I always thought my success was something I needed to build on my own," she began, her gaze fixed on his. "But now that I think about it, we both have something unique together, and I don't think I've ever been more ready to embrace a partnership than I am now." She smiled, her decision clear in her heart, as she saw the expression of happiness and relief on his face. "So, it's a yes?" he asked, his voice filled with an almost youthful excitement, as if the idea of starting something together brought new youth to his dreams. Harper nodded, the smile spreading across her face. "It's a yes, Alexander, but I want us to know exactly what we're creating and where we want to go. We're going to build a company that is a reflection of both of us, with our values and our vision." Over the next few months, Harper and Alexander dove headfirst into planning and developing the new company. The process was intense, requiring even greater dedication than both had put into their previous companies. They shared responsibilities, set objectives, and most importantly, kept communication open, without fear of disagreeing or pointing out different paths. For the first time, they were building something that truly belonged to both of them. Over time, the venture took shape. They chose a name that reflected the essence of the partnership, Innova, a name that captured the idea of innovation and constant growth, of a movement they both believed was only possible with a foundation of respect and collaboration. Innova soon stood out in the market, with a proposal that combined Alexander's strategic talent and Harper's creative and empathetic vision. As the company grew, the harmony between work and personal relationships became more evident. Harper and Alexander learned to balance responsibilities and challenges without allowing external pressures to interfere with what was most important to them: the love and trust they had built. Each meeting, each negotiation, and each strategic decision was an opportunity to reaffirm the commitment they had made, to never let pride or fear interfere with their union. However, as with any journey, they faced difficulties. At times, differences of opinion arose, and both needed to work even harder on communication, ensuring that decisions were made with mutual respect. There were nights when they returned home exhausted, but a quiet conversation, dinner together, or a simple hug reminded them of the greater purpose that brought them together. Innova was a reflection of what they had become, an innovative company that carried within it the weight of a reborn love. Over time, the company grew and began to expand its projects to other markets. The media began to cover the partnership between them, the love story that permeated Innova's success. Industry reporters and business people saw Harper and Alexander as an inspiring couple, an example that love and business, when well balanced, could result in something extraordinary. Harper, previously accustomed to discretion, learned to deal with exposure, always at Alexander's side, always reaffirming their commitment to each other. One day, during an interview for a technology magazine, the journalist asked them what the secret to the success of that unusual partnership was. Alexander looked at Harper, a soft smile on his face, and replied, "The secret is knowing that we are together not just because of the company's success, but because we are each other's support and balance. Our purpose goes beyond numbers and achievements. We want to create a legacy, something that inspires other people to believe in their dreams without losing sight of what really matters." Harper, touched by Alexander's words, added, "We learned that a true partnership requires respect, sincerity, and above all, humility. It is often necessary to put pride aside and listen to what the other has to say. And in this case, we learned this the hard way, but also the true way." The interview was a success, and the article quickly spread, making Harper and Alexander's story an inspiration for entrepreneurs and couples across the country. The impact was so positive that, sometime later, they decided to launch a mentoring program for young entrepreneurs, helping them develop businesses that reflect their values and ambitions. This program soon became a fundamental part of Innova, and Harper and Alexander saw how their love and partnership echoed in projects and ideas that went beyond their own. At the end of a long day, as they closed the office together, Alexander grabbed her hand, pulling her close to him. "Harper, who would have thought we'd make it this far? It feels surreal sometimes to think about everything we've overcome." She smiled, returning his handshake. "I never imagined it either, but I wouldn't trade any of it. Every challenge, every mistake, and every reconciliation, it was all worth it." He hugged her, and for a moment, they sat there in silence, feeling the weight of everything they had built. They knew that they were just at the beginning, that there was still a lot to be conquered and learned. But in that moment, they were certain that, together, they could face anything, and that their story was living proof that love and ambition, when balanced with respect and humility, could create something truly great.